Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. November in Nebraska can be unpredictable, but nobody expected what hit us that Tuesday before Thanksgiving. My brother Nathan called me around noon from his job at the hardware store. Said they were selling generators like hotcakes because the weather service was predicting something nasty. I remember laughing it off. Told him people always panic over nothing. My wife Diane was already at the grocery store with our daughter Megan, who just turned 16 that October, grabbing last-minute ingredients for the holiday meal we were hosting. My parents were driving up from Kansas City the next day, and Diane's sister was bringing her kids from Omaha. We had the biggest house in the family, a 2-story colonial we'd bought after I made partner at the accounting firm, so holiday hosting duties usually fell to us. By 4 that afternoon, the temperature had dropped 40 degrees in 2 hours, and the rain that had been falling all morning turned into something between sleet and freezing rain that coated everything it touched. I left the office early when I saw co-workers scraping inch-thick ice off their windshields in the parking lot. The drive home usually took 20 minutes, but that day, it took me almost 2 hours, crawling along at 10 miles per hour, watching cars slide into ditches left and right. When I finally pulled into our garage, the power was already flickering, and Diane met me at the door with that worried look she gets when she's been watching too much local news. She said the weather guy was calling it a once-in-a-decade ice storm, and sure enough, just as I was hanging up my coat, everything went dark. We had candles and flashlights ready since power outages weren't uncommon in our neighborhood, but this was different. You could hear the ice accumulating on the trees outside, these sharp cracking sounds every few minutes as branches gave way under the weight. Megan was in the living room, wrapped in a blanket, complaining that her phone was at 12% battery and asking why we didn't have one of those whole house backup batteries like her friend Ashley's family. Nathan showed up around 7, just walked right in without knocking like he always did, carrying this red portable generator he'd snagged from the store. Said it was the last one on the shelf, some brand I'd never heard of, but it would keep our furnace running and maybe a few lights. He'd brought extra gas cans too, 4 of them, which he lined up against the garage wall like soldiers. The temperature inside the house was already dropping fast, maybe 60 degrees and falling, and you could see your breath in the hallway. Diane had pulled out every blanket we owned and made a nest in the family room where we all huddled together, eating cold sandwiches and trying to make the best of it. Nathan spent about an hour reading the generator manual by flashlight, then headed out to the garage to set it up. I helped him position it near the garage door, which we cracked open about 6 inches for ventilation, just like the manual said. The thing roared to life on the 3rd pull, sounding like a lawnmower on steroids, and within minutes, we had the furnace humming again and a few lights on in the main rooms. We all cheered like we'd just won the lottery, and Diane actually cried a little from relief. Round 9, Nathan decided to head home before the roads got any worse, though I tried to convince him to stay. His apartment was only 10 minutes away, but in these conditions, that meant almost an hour of white-knuckle driving. After he left, we settled in for the night, grateful for the warmth spreading through the house. Megan went up to her room first, said she had homework to finish before the break, though I knew she just wanted to charge her phone and text her boyfriend while she had power. Diane and I stayed up until maybe 11, playing cards by lamplight and listening to the ice storm rage outside. Every now and then, I'd go check on the generator through the door to the garage, making sure it had enough gas, and each time that steady rumble reassured me we'd make it through the night just fine. I woke up around 2 in the morning with the strangest headache, like someone had wrapped a belt around my skull and was slowly tightening it. My mouth was completely dry, and when I sat up, the room tilted slightly, not quite spinning but definitely unstable. I figured I was dehydrated from the dry furnace air and stumbled to the bathroom for water and ibuprofen. Diane was sleeping hard beside me, snoring louder than usual, which was odd because she rarely snored unless she was sick. On my way back to bed, I noticed our bedroom door was closed, which we never did because Diane liked the air circulation. Must have shut it without thinking, I told myself, though something nagged at me about that. The headache faded after a few minutes, and I drifted back to sleep, thinking about all the cooking we'd have to do tomorrow if the power came back. The next time I opened my eyes, pale gray light was filtering through the bedroom curtains, and my phone showed 7:43. The headache was back, worse than before, pounding behind my eyeballs like a drumbeat. Diane was already up, probably downstairs making coffee on the camp stove we kept for emergencies. I pulled on yesterday's clothes and headed for Megan's room to wake her up, since she could sleep through anything. Her door was closed too, and when I knocked, there was no response. Not unusual for a teenager who stayed up late, so I knocked harder, then finally just opened the door. She was still in bed, buried under 3 blankets, completely still. I called her name, walked over to shake her shoulder, and that's when I realized she wasn't just sleeping deeply. My mind went blank for a second, then exploded into action. Her skin had this grayish tint, and when I pulled back the blankets, she was completely limp. I screamed for Diane while checking for a pulse, found one, but it was weak and way too fast. Diane came running up the stairs, took one look, and immediately called 911 while I started CPR, the way I'd learned it years ago for a workplace safety course. The dispatcher kept asking questions Diane couldn't answer. What happened? Any medications? Any injuries? And all we could say was that she wouldn't wake up. The paramedics took 12 minutes to arrive, 12 minutes that felt like hours, with me doing chest compressions until my arms burned and Diane sobbing beside me. They pushed me aside, started working on her with practiced efficiency, got her on oxygen, started an IV, loaded her onto a gurney. One of the paramedics, a young woman with a tight ponytail, kept asking us questions while her partner worked on Megan. Any drugs in the house, had she been drinking? Any history of seizures, and then she asked about heating, if we had any space heaters running or a fireplace going. I told her about the generator in the garage, and her face changed immediately. She grabbed her radio, said something about possible CO poisoning, then told her partner they needed to move now. She turned to us and said we needed to get out of the house immediately and wait outside for the fire department. Diane was already following the gurney, but the paramedic grabbed my arm, looked me straight in the eye, and asked if anyone else was in the house. When I said no, she asked about the generator again, where exactly it was, how long it had been running. I explained about the garage. The door cracked open for ventilation, running since about 8 the previous night. The fire department arrived just as the ambulance was pulling away with Diane and Megan inside. I wanted to follow them to the hospital, but the captain, a massive guy named Brennan according to his helmet, wouldn't let me drive. He had one of his crew checking me with some kind of meter while he asked more questions about the generator setup. The meter started beeping, and the firefighter showed it to Brennan, who immediately had me sit down on the bumper of the truck and put an oxygen mask on my face. He explained that I had elevated carbon monoxide levels in my blood, not critical, but enough that I shouldn't be driving. They went into my house with some equipment, came back out 10 minutes later shaking their heads. Brennan sat down next to me, pulled out a notebook and started explaining how carbon monoxide works, how it builds up in enclosed spaces, how that 6-inch gap we left wasn't nearly enough ventilation for a generator that size. He told me the readings in the house were still over 400 parts per million near the garage door, and probably much higher overnight when the generator was running full blast to keep the furnace going. The gas had seeped through the vents, the walls, even tiny gaps under doors, filling the house slowly while we slept. Megan's room was right above the garage, which is why she got the worst of it. He said we were lucky to be alive, that whole families have died from exactly this same mistake. The oxygen started clearing my head, and with that clarity came a crushing weight in my chest that had nothing to do with carbon monoxide. I kept thinking about Nathan bringing that generator, how proud we were when it started up, how we thought we were being so careful. Brennan must have seen it on my face because he put his hand on my shoulder, told me it happens more than people think. that generators kill more people during power outages than the actual storms do. A neighbor, George, from 2 houses down, drove me to the hospital while the fire department aired out our house. In the emergency room, they had me on high-flow oxygen for 3 hours while running blood tests every 30 minutes. Diane was in another room getting the same treatment, but Megan was in the ICU on something called hyperbaric oxygen therapy. The doctor, a tired-looking woman who couldn't have been much older than Nathan, explained that Megan had severe carbon monoxide poisoning, that her levels were near fatal when she arrived. She said the next 24 hours would be critical, that even if Megan recovered, there could be neurological damage, problems with memory, coordination, things that might not show up for weeks. Diane and I took turns sitting with her in the ICU, watching machines breathe for her, holding her hand and talking to her like she could hear us, telling her about the Thanksgiving dinner we'd make when she got better, how her cousins were still coming, how we'd tell this story years from now and be grateful we survived it. Megan woke up on Thanksgiving morning, groggy and confused but awake, asking why she was in the hospital and why her head hurt so bad. The doctors ran test after test, checking her reflexes, her memory, her coordination, and everything came back normal, or close enough to normal that they called it a miracle. She didn't remember anything after going to bed that Tuesday night, just waking up in a hospital room with machines all around her. We spent Thanksgiving in the hospital cafeteria, eating dry turkey and lumpy mashed potatoes that tasted better than any meal I'd ever had because we were all there together, alive. Nathan came by with flowers he'd bought at a gas station, his eyes red from crying, apologizing over and over for bringing the generator. But I told him it wasn't his fault, that we all thought we were being safe. My parents and Diane's sister arrived that afternoon, and we had to explain everything again, watch their faces go from confusion to horror to relief. We were discharged Friday afternoon with strict instructions to install carbon monoxide detectors on every floor of the house, which seems so obvious now that I can't believe we didn't have them before. The power had come back Thursday morning while we were still in the hospital, and neighbors had already moved the generator out of our garage, left it sitting in the driveway like evidence at a crime scene. I sold it the next week to a guy who promised he'd only use it outside, far from any buildings, though part of me wanted to take a sledgehammer to it instead. Megan went back to school after Thanksgiving break, seemed completely fine, but Diane and I watched her constantly those first few weeks, looking for any sign of the delayed problems the doctor had warned us about. They never came, thank God, but even now, 2 years later, whenever there's a storm warning, whenever the power flickers, Diane and I look at each other with the same thought, remembering how close we came to losing everything because we thought 6 inches was enough. I run an IT consulting firm from my home office in Colorado Springs, and that November afternoon, I was deep in server migration planning when my phone rang. An unknown number, but potential clients often called from numbers I didn't recognize, especially now that business was picking up after 2 lean years. A woman with a flat professional voice asked if she could speak with Brandon Novak about an outstanding debt. Wrong number, I told her, but she insisted this was the number on file, then asked if I could just verify the address they had. Red flags everywhere. I hung up, blocked the number, and got back to my spreadsheets. 20 minutes later, another unknown number, different area code. Same script about debt collection and needing to confirm my address. By the time I went to bed that night, I'd received 14 calls from different numbers, all following the same pattern. Some were recorded messages, others had real people who knew my full name, middle initial included, and kept pushing for address confirmation. My wife Amy thought maybe someone with a similar name had given out a wrong number by mistake. We'd only been in this house for 18 months, having moved here after I left my corporate job to go solo with the consulting business. Our neighbors were mostly retired couples who kept to themselves, and we hadn't had any issues before this. I put my phone on silent and figured whoever they were looking for would eventually sort things out, with the actual collection agency. Around 6 the next morning, I woke up to pounding on my front door, the kind that makes your heart jump before your brain catches up. Through the peephole, I saw 2 police officers standing on my porch, their breath visible in the cold morning air. When I opened the door, still in my pajama pants and old conference t-shirt from a tech summit, the younger officer asked if I was Brandon Novak. After I confirmed, he explained they'd received a 911 call about 40 minutes earlier from someone claiming to be me, saying I was having thoughts of self-harm and had access to firearms. The caller had provided my full name, this exact address, even my cell phone number. I stood there trying to process what he was saying while Amy appeared behind me, wrapping her robe tighter against the morning chill. The officers needed to come in, they said, just to verify everyone was safe, standard protocol for welfare checks. We spent the next 20 minutes convincing them that neither of us had made that call, that I didn't own any guns, and that I was perfectly fine mentally, just confused and increasingly concerned. The older officer, a sergeant with gray temples, took notes while I explained about the debt collection calls from the previous day. He nodded like he'd heard similar stories before, mentioned something about swatting and doxing becoming more common, though this seemed mild compared to some cases. They gave me a case number, suggested I file a report about the harassment, and left just as my neighbors were starting their morning routines, several of them watching from their driveways. Amy made coffee while I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my phone, and wondering who would go through this much trouble to mess with me. I couldn't focus on work that day, jumping every time my phone buzzed even though the calls had stopped completely after the police visit. Amy worked from the living room instead of her usual spot at the downtown law firm, said she didn't feel comfortable leaving me alone after what happened. We installed a Ring doorbell that afternoon, one of those video ones that sends alerts to your phone, and I spent way too much time checking the app every time a car drove past. The rest of the day passed without incident, just the 2 of us pretending to work while really just waiting for something else to happen. Around 9 that night, after we'd both given up any pretense of productivity and settled in to watch some mindless TV, I got a notification from the Ring app. Motion detected at your front door. The video feed showed our porch, dimly lit by the motion sensor light we'd installed last year. Nobody was there, but something had triggered it. I scrolled back through the recording and saw it, just for a second. A figure walking up to our door and placing something on the mat before quickly backing away, staying just out of range of the clear camera view. All I could make out was a dark jacket and what might have been a baseball cap. Amy was already calling the police while I stood at the window, trying to see if anyone was still out there. The street looked empty, just parked cars and the glow from porch lights. After 5 minutes of watching and waiting, I carefully opened the door, staying behind it like it was a shield, and looked down at the mat. There was a manila envelope, no writing on the outside, sealed with regular tape. I brought it inside using a pair of kitchen tongs, which felt ridiculous but also necessary somehow. Amy told me not to open it until the police arrived, but we both knew they wouldn't come quickly for a non-emergency envelope delivery. I held it up to the light, could see papers inside, what looked like printed documents. After debating for another minute, I put on latex gloves from Amy's cleaning supplies and carefully opened one end with scissors. Inside were about a dozen pages, printouts from various websites. The first was a screenshot of my LinkedIn profile, but edited, with my job history changed to include positions at companies I'd never worked for, including one that had been investigated for fraud 2 years ago. The next page was from a dating site I'd never heard of, with my photo and name but claiming I was divorced and looking for discreet encounters. Page after page of fabricated profiles, all using my real information mixed with lies, posted on job sites, forums, even a registry for sex offenders with my name and address, though thankfully that one was just a mock-up, not actually posted. The last page made my chest tighten in a way the others hadn't. It was a printed photo of our house taken during the day, probably with a phone camera from across the street. But someone had edited it, drawn red arrows pointing to different windows with labels like home office, master bedroom, and bathroom. In the corner, someone had written in pen, not printed but actually handwritten. "Nice setup, Brandon. We should talk about your consulting rates." Amy grabbed the pages from me when she saw my face change, and I watched her expression shift from concern to genuine fear as she flipped through them. She immediately started taking photos of each page with her phone, her lawyer instincts kicking in, documenting everything while muttering about harassment charges and restraining orders. We didn't sleep much that night, even with a patrol car doing periodic drive-bys as promised. Every sound outside had us checking the Ring app. Every car that slowed down made us peek through the blinds. Around 3 in the morning, Amy finally crashed on the couch while I sat in the kitchen with my laptop, searching for any of these fake profiles online. I found 2 of them still active, the dating site one and a forum post where I was offering discount IT services for cash only, no contracts needed. I took screenshots and started the process of reporting them, but most sites wanted extensive verification to remove content, and I knew it would take days or weeks. The worst part was not knowing why this was happening or who was behind it. I'd been through my client list 3 times, looking for anyone who might have a grudge, any project that had gone badly, but came up empty. Friday morning came too fast, and neither of us went to work. Amy called her office to say she had a family emergency, and I canceled my 2 video calls, claiming internet issues. We were drinking our 3rd pot of coffee when my phone rang, a local number I didn't recognize. Against Amy's advice, I answered it. A man's voice, rough like he'd been smoking for decades, asked if I was the Brandon offering IT services for cash. When I started to explain that was a fake post, he cut me off. Said he didn't care about that, but wanted to know if I was the same Brandon who used to work at Systematics Corp back in 2018. My whole body went cold. I had worked there briefly as a contractor for 4 months before the company imploded in a massive embezzlement scandal. I wasn't involved, had actually left 2 weeks before the FBI raids, but anyone connected to that place had their reputation damaged. The man chuckled when I went silent, said we definitely needed to meet, that he had a business proposition that would benefit both of us. I told him I wasn't interested in any proposition, and started to hang up when he said something that stopped me cold. He mentioned Amy's maiden name, the law firm where she worked, even the floor number of her office. Said it would be a shame if her colleagues found out about her husband's connection to Systematics, especially the encrypted files I'd supposedly helped hide before leaving. That was complete fiction. I'd never touched anything related to their financial systems, but he said he had documents that suggested otherwise. The call ended with him saying I had until midnight to reconsider, and that he'd be reaching out with instructions. Amy heard enough from my side to understand what was happening. This wasn't random harassment anymore. This was extortion. And whoever this was had done serious homework on both of us. That evening, while Amy was on the phone with a colleague who specialized in cybercrime, I noticed something on the Ring app that I'd missed before. Going back through the saved footage from the past few days, I saw the same car, a dark blue sedan with mud covering the license plate, had driven past our house at least 15 times since Wednesday. Always slowing down near our driveway, never stopping, just crawling past like they were checking something. I started downloading all the footage when the doorbell triggered again. This time the camera caught him clearly, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a gray beard and wire-rimmed glasses, wearing a Broncos cap and a brown leather jacket. He stood there for maybe 10 seconds looking directly at the camera with this slight smile, then held up a piece of paper with 11:47 p.m. written on it before walking away. Amy called the police immediately while I checked every door and window lock in the house. The responding officer, different from the morning crew, took one look at the video and called for backup. Within 20 minutes, we had 3 patrol cars on our street and a detective named Rivera sitting at our kitchen table, going through everything from the beginning. She recognized the description of the man from the video, said his name was Carl Brennan, a former private investigator who'd lost his license 5 years ago for illegally accessing personal records and selling them. He'd been connected to 3 other extortion cases but never convicted, always managing to stay just within the gray areas of the law. Rivera said he usually worked with someone else, a tech guy who handled the digital harassment while Carl did the physical intimidation. At 11:47 p.m. exactly, my phone buzzed with a text from a blocked number. Just an address, a warehouse district on the south side of the city, and the words, "Come alone or the files go public Monday." Rivera was already shaking her head before I finished reading it out loud. They'd set up surveillance on our house and would follow if Carl or anyone else showed up, but she strongly advised against going to that address. Amy was more direct, said I'd be an idiot to walk into what was obviously a trap, but Carl had done his homework too well. He knew about systematics, knew that even false allegations with fabricated evidence could destroy my business, especially in the small world of IT consulting, where reputation was everything. Rivera left 2 officers parked outside and gave us her direct number, said they'd be increasing patrols all night, and that a cyber crimes unit was already working on tracking the phone numbers and fake profiles. I didn't go to the warehouse. Instead, I did what I should have done from the beginning, used my actual IT skills to fight back. While Carl was waiting at whatever trap he'd set, I was working with an old colleague from my corporate days who specialized in digital forensics. We traced the fake profiles back to a specific IP address, found the digital fingerprints Carl's tech partner had left behind. By 4 a.m. Saturday morning, we had enough evidence that Rivera could get a warrant. Turns out Carl's partner was a guy named Dennis Huang, who ran a computer repair shop that was barely staying afloat. The police raided both the shop and Carl's apartment Saturday afternoon, found everything: the software they used for the robocalls, the templates for fake documents, even recordings of Carl bragging about previous extortion schemes he'd pulled on other former Systematics employees. The whole thing unraveled faster than I expected. Dennis flipped immediately, gave up everything about Carl's operation in exchange for a plea deal. They'd been running this scheme for 2 years, targeting anyone connected to corporate scandals, betting that most people would pay rather than risk their reputations. 7 other victims came forward once the arrests made the news. Carl got 8 years, Dennis got 3 with probation. The fake profiles took weeks to fully clean up, and I still occasionally get calls from lawyers offering to help with my debt situation, but my business survived. Amy and I moved 6 months later, not because we had to, but because we wanted to. The new house has better security, no basement access points, and neighbors who actually talk to each other. I still check the Ring app more than I should, and unknown numbers go straight to voicemail, but at least now when I see a car slow down near my driveway, it's usually just someone checking their GPS or looking for a house number, not someone documenting my life for their next extortion attempt. November always meant double shifts at Garrison's department store, and when Colleen asked if anyone could cover overnight inventory that Friday after Thanksgiving, I needed the extra cash too badly to say no. 26, and still paying off student loans from a journalism degree I never used. I spent most nights stocking shelves and folding endless racks of winter coats that customers would destroy again by morning. That particular Friday, the store had closed at midnight after the Black Friday chaos, and I arrived at 1 in the morning with my thermos of coffee and a podcast downloaded on my phone, thinking it would be just another boring shift counting merchandise in the stockroom, while the mall sat dark and empty around us. Garrison's had this eerie quality after closing that I'd gotten used to over the past 8 months of working there, but that night hit different from the moment I badged in through the employee entrance. Usually there'd be at least 3 or 4 people for overnight inventory, but Colleen had texted that she'd gotten food poisoning from her mom's turkey stuffing, and Brad's car had broken down on the highway coming back from his parents' place in Michigan. Just me and Hector from maintenance, she'd said, and he'd already started his rounds on the opposite end of the mall. I walked through the back corridors toward our department, passing the break room where someone had left half a pumpkin pie in the fridge with a post-it note saying free, and the familiar Muzak played through the overhead speakers at that barely audible volume they always forgot to turn completely off. My department was women's formal wear, right in the center of the second floor, surrounded by those tall mannequins wearing sequined holiday dresses and velvet blazers that cost more than my rent. The overnight inventory list showed I needed to count everything in storage sections D through H, which meant about 4 hours of scanning barcodes and checking them against the spreadsheet on the tablet they'd given me. I started with the back corridor where we kept the overstock, boxes stacked to the ceiling with next season's spring collection, already waiting to replace all the winter merchandise. The fluorescent lights hummed that specific frequency that gave me headaches if I stayed back there too long, and I could hear the ventilation system cycling on and off, making the plastic inventory tags flutter against the boxes like tiny fingers tapping for attention. Around 2:30 in the morning, after I'd gotten through sections D and E, I decided to grab water from the vending machine near the customer service desk on the main floor. I walked out onto the sales floor, and that's when I noticed the mannequins for the first time that night. Really noticed them. We had about 40 of them in our department. These faceless white figures with their heads tilted at specific angles that corporate had mandated in some visual merchandising guide, all positioned to draw customers' eyes toward the featured collections. But standing there in the semi-darkness with only the emergency lighting and that faint music still playing, they looked like a crowd of people frozen mid-conversation, their blank faces somehow managing to convey expressions despite having no features at all. I grabbed my water quickly and headed back to the stockroom, telling myself I was being ridiculous, that I'd worked plenty of night shifts before without getting spooked by plastic display figures. Section F was taking forever because someone had mislabeled half the boxes during the last shipment, and I had to open each one to verify the contents matched the inventory codes. My phone battery was dying faster than usual, probably from the terrible signal in the stockroom, so I'd turned off my podcast to save power. Without that distraction, every sound seemed amplified in the quiet. The settling of cardboard boxes, the distant clank of pipes in the walls, and that endless muzak that had switched from instrumental Christmas songs to some generic jazz that sounded like it was recorded underwater. I was crouched between two tall shelving units scanning a box of cashmere scarves when the announcement system crackled to life above me, making me drop the scanner, which clattered against the concrete floor and skittered under the bottom shelf. At first I thought it was just feedback or maybe Hector testing the system, but then I heard the voice and my whole body went rigid because I recognized it immediately. "Attention Garrison shoppers. The time is now 10 o'clock and our store will be closing in 15 minutes. Please bring your final selections to the registers located at the front of each department. We thank you for shopping with us today and look forward to seeing you again soon. Garrisons, where style meets savings." It was the closing announcement, word for word, the same one that played every single night, except this time it was playing at 3 in the morning in a completely empty store. But that wasn't the worst part. Wasn't the thing that made me stand up so fast I knocked over an entire stack of boxes behind me. The voice making the announcement, that cheery professional voice echoing through the empty store, was mine. They'd recorded me doing the announcement 3 months ago when the regular girl, Janet, had quit without notice, and management needed someone with what they called a friendly but authoritative tone to record all the store messages. I'd spent an entire afternoon in the manager's office reading different scripts into a microphone while Keith from corporate fiddled with audio levels on his laptop, making me repeat phrases until my throat was raw. But hearing it now, at 3 in the morning, when I knew for certain that nobody was in the control room where the announcement system was operated, made every muscle in my body tense up. The message repeated again, my own voice bouncing off the walls of the stockroom, and this time I noticed something wrong with it, like the playback speed was just slightly off, making me sound hollow and strange, the way voices sound when you hear them through a long tunnel or from the bottom of a well. I grabbed my phone and called Hector's cell, but it went straight to voicemail, which wasn't unusual since reception was terrible in most parts of the building. My legs felt unsteady as I made my way out of the stockroom, through the swinging doors that led to the sales floor, trying to convince myself there had to be a logical explanation, maybe a computer glitch or someone playing a prank. though I couldn't imagine who would bother with something so elaborate. The announcement had stopped by the time I reached the sales floor, leaving only that quiet muzak and the hum of the escalators that never stopped running even after hours. I headed toward the stairs that led down to the first floor, where the security office was located, thinking I could check the cameras or at least find the overnight security guard, who was supposed to be monitoring everything from his desk. But as I passed through my department, something made me stop dead in my tracks, and I had to blink several times to make sure I was actually seeing what I thought I was seeing. Every single mannequin in the women's formal wear department had been turned around. When I'd walked through earlier to get water, they'd all been facing outward toward the aisles, positioned to display their outfits to anyone walking by, just like always. Now they were facing inward, 40 pale figures creating a circle around the central display platform, where we kept the featured holiday collection, their eyeless faces directed at the empty space in the middle, like they were watching something I couldn't see. The sequined dresses caught the emergency lighting and threw sparkles across the walls that moved slightly with the air circulation, creating the illusion of movement, of breathing, of life where there shouldn't be any. I took a step backward and bumped into something solid, nearly screaming before I realized it was just one of the jewelry display cases, but the sound I made, that sharp intake of breath, seemed to echo in the silence that had suddenly fallen over the store because even the muzak had stopped playing. My phone buzzed in my pocket, making me jump again, and I saw a text from an unknown number that just said, "Check the fitting rooms." I didn't recognize the number, and when I tried to call it back, I got an automated message saying the number was disconnected. The smart thing would have been to leave right then, just walk out through the employee exit and forget about the inventory, forget about the overtime pay, forget about everything except getting as far away from that store as possible. But something, maybe curiosity or maybe just the stubborn refusal to believe that anything genuinely threatening was happening, made me walk toward the fitting rooms at the back of our department. They were these small cubicles with heavy burgundy curtains instead of doors, 6 rooms in a row with a long mirror at the end of the hallway. And as I got closer, I could hear something that made me slow down, then stop completely. It was my voice again, coming from inside one of the rooms, but this time it wasn't the store announcement. This time it was a conversation I'd had with my mother on the phone 2 days ago, word for word, my side only, talking about how I was thinking about going back to school, how I was tired of retail, how I felt like I was wasting my life folding clothes for people who barely looked at me. The curtain of the middle fitting room was moving slightly, like someone had just brushed past it, and I could see a shadow underneath, the unmistakable shape of feet, except they weren't moving at all, just standing there perfectly still, while my recorded voice continued playing from inside. I reached for the curtain with trembling fingers, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, and yanked it open in one quick motion. The fitting room was empty except for a small digital recorder sitting on the bench, the kind we used for taking inventory notes, playing that private conversation on a loop. But on the mirror, someone had written a message in what looked like dark red lipstick, the expensive kind we sold at the cosmetics counter for $40 a tube, and the words made my knees weak. "You looked better in the blue dress." Thursday, November 14th, 2:47 p.m. That was 2 weeks ago, a random afternoon when I'd tried on a dress from the clearance rack during my lunch break, alone in these same fitting rooms, or at least I'd thought I was alone. I grabbed the recorder and ran, not caring any more about logic or explanations or anything, except getting out of that store. As I sprinted through the departments, past the mannequins that seemed to turn their heads to track my movement, though I knew that was impossible, the announcement system crackled back to life. But this time it wasn't my voice. It was dozens of voices, all mine but from different recordings, different conversations, different phone calls, all spliced together into an incomprehensible cacophony of my own words, rearranged into new sentences that made no sense but somehow felt threatening, like someone had been collecting pieces of me for months, storing them up for this moment. The escalator was still running, and I took the steps 3 at a time, nearly falling when my foot caught on the metal grooves, and behind me I could hear footsteps, or what sounded like footsteps, that deliberate click of heels on tile that echoed through the empty store. Except the rhythm was wrong. Too many feet, like every mannequin in the building, had stepped off their platforms and started following me. The employee exit was on the first floor near the loading dock, and I slammed into the door so hard the impact knocked the wind out of me, fumbling with my keycard while those footsteps got closer, multiplying, surrounding me from different directions. The lock finally clicked open, and I burst out into the cold November air, not stopping until I reached my car parked under the single functioning streetlight in the employee lot. I sat there for 20 minutes with the doors locked and the engine running, watching the store through my rearview mirror, waiting to see someone, anyone, come out after me, but nothing moved except the occasional piece of trash blown by the wind. Finally, I called the police from my car, told them someone had broken into the store, that I'd heard intruders and fled for my safety. 2 officers arrived within 15 minutes, and I waited in my car while they searched the building with the security guard, who'd apparently been asleep in the break room the entire time, and hadn't heard anything unusual. They found Keith from corporate in a storage room on the 3rd floor, surrounded by monitors and recording equipment he'd been using to spy on employees for the past 6 months. He'd installed hidden cameras in the fitting rooms, the break room, even the bathrooms, and had been living in the store after hours, sleeping in different storage areas, stealing food from the cafe, using employee keycards he'd copied to move around undetected. The police found hundreds of hours of recordings, not just of me but of every woman who worked there, spliced and edited into bizarre compilations he'd been uploading to private forums online. He'd been fired from 3 previous retail chains for similar behavior, but somehow kept getting hired because nobody ever pressed charges, just wanted him gone quietly. They arrested him that morning, and I gave my statement at the police station while still wearing my garrison's uniform, which I left balled up in their trash can on my way out, because I knew I'd never wear it again. The store closed permanently 2 months later after the lawsuit, and I heard they turned it into a gym or something, but I've never been back to check. I did go back to school though, studying cybersecurity now. Funny how things work out, and I always check for cameras wherever I go, always listen for that subtle hum of recording equipment, because once you know someone's been watching you without your knowledge, you never really stop looking over your shoulder. Mom was arguing with the turkey when I walked through the door that Wednesday afternoon, wrestling the 20-pound bird into submission while muttering something about defrosting times and stubborn packaging. I just finished a 12-hour shift at the hospital in Tulsa and driven straight to my parents' farmhouse, still wearing my scrubs under my jacket because I knew she'd panic if I showed up late. The kitchen windows were fogged up from all the cooking, and through the condensation, I could see the wheat fields stretching endlessly under a sky that had turned an odd yellowish-gray color. Ashley, my younger sister, was stationed at the stove stirring gravy with one hand while bouncing her baby on her hip, and her 2 older boys were running circles around the dining table, their sneakers squeaking on the old linoleum. Dad had barricaded himself in the living room with the Weather Channel on, volume cranked up high enough that we could all hear the meteorologist discussing pressure systems and cloud formations. Strange thing about that afternoon was how still everything felt outside, like nature had hit the pause button while we rushed around inside preparing for tomorrow's feast. Ashley's husband Robert was supposed to arrive later with his mother, and Mom kept checking her phone for updates from my brother Kevin, who was driving in from Arkansas with his new girlfriend none of us had met yet. The house felt alive with all this movement and anticipation, pots bubbling, oven timer beeping, kids yelling about who got to lick the beater from the mashed potatoes. I remember washing my hands at the sink, looking out at our old storm cellar about 50 yards from the house, its wooden doors covered in fallen leaves, and thinking how we hadn't opened that thing since I was probably 16, maybe 17. Back when Dad still made us practice tornado drills every spring. Around 4:30, I was helping Ashley peel potatoes when the power flickered once, just quick enough to reset the microwave clock but not enough to worry about. Dad called out from the living room that the weather service had mentioned some cells developing to the southwest, but nothing heading our way. Maybe some rain later tonight at worst. The boys had moved their chaos outside, and through the window I could see them throwing a football around in that aggressive way kids do when they're trying to prove who's tougher. The air through the screen door felt thick and warm for November, almost like breathing through a wet towel, and Mom complained about her arthritis acting up, which she swore meant a storm was coming despite what the weatherman said. I stepped out onto the back porch to call the boys in for a snack, and that's when I noticed how the birds had gone completely silent. Not a single chirp, no crows calling from the fields, even the chickens in their coop had stopped their usual chatter. The sky to the west had turned this sick green color, like old copper, and the clouds were moving in different directions at different heights, creating this twisted, churning effect that made my chest feel tight. But there were no sirens, no emergency alerts buzzing on our phones, just this unnatural quiet that pressed against my eardrums. I called the boys again, louder this time, and they came running toward the house, their football abandoned in the yellowing grass. We'd barely made it inside when the windows started rattling in their frames, subtle at first, like a truck passing on a distant road, except there was no road close enough to cause that kind of vibration. Ashley looked up from the stove, her face suddenly pale, and asked if anyone else heard that low rumbling sound, like a freight train but wrong somehow, too consistent, too close. Dad jumped up from his recliner and ran to the front door, yanking it open, and I'll never forget the way his whole body went rigid when he saw what was coming. Over his shoulder I could see it too, a dark, writhing column dropping down from the clouds less than a mile away, tearing through the Johnson's cornfield, throwing debris hundreds of feet into the air like confetti made of destruction. Everything happened so fast after that, but each second stretched out like minutes in my memory. Dad screaming for everyone to get to the cellar now, his voice cracking in a way I'd never heard before, not even when Grandpa died. Mom dropping the glass casserole dish, sending sweet potato chunks and broken ceramic across the floor. Ashley clutching her baby so tight he started wailing, her older boys standing frozen in the doorway, eyes wide as dinner plates. The power cut out completely then, plunging us into this eerie green-tinted darkness, and through the windows we could see transformers exploding in brilliant blue flashes down the road. The rumbling had become a roar, so loud it hurt your teeth, and the whole house started groaning like it was being squeezed in a giant fist. Mom was screaming about the pantry, pointing at the reinforced closet under the stairs where we kept the canned goods and cleaning supplies, saying it was closer, safer, we'd never make it to the cellar in time. But Dad was already pushing us toward the back door, yelling that the house wouldn't hold, that the pantry was a death trap. We had to get underground. I grabbed the two older boys, one under each arm, while Ashley struggled with the baby, and Mom stood paralyzed between the two options, her hands shaking as she looked back and forth between Dad at the back door and the pantry door just 10 feet away. The wind hit the house then, not gradually but all at once, like getting slammed by an invisible wall, and suddenly the kitchen window exploded inward, sending glass shards across the room where we'd been standing seconds before. Dad made the choice for all of us, grabbing Mom's wrist and dragging her toward the back door while shouting at me to run. Just run. Don't look back. The second we stepped outside, the wind tried to rip us apart, pulling at our clothes, our hair, making it impossible to breathe without turning your head sideways. The 50 yards to the storm cellar looked like 50 miles, the wooden doors barely visible through the horizontal rain that had started falling, mixed with dirt and pieces of corn stalks and God knows what else. I could hear metal screeching behind us, probably the barn roof peeling away like a tin can lid, and Ashley's oldest boy was screaming in my arms, his voice barely audible over the apocalyptic noise that surrounded us from every direction. Dad reached the cellar doors first, fighting against the wind to pull them open, the old hinges screaming in protest after years of neglect. The left door ripped completely off its hinges the moment he got it open, flying away into the chaos like it weighed nothing. But the right door held long enough for him to push Mom down the concrete steps into the darkness below. I practically threw the boys down after her, hearing them tumble and cry out. But there was no time to be gentle, no time for anything but survival. Ashley was right behind me with the baby, and we all crashed down those steps in a tangle of limbs and terror. The temperature dropping 20 degrees the moment we got below ground level. The musty smell of old earth and decades of spider webs filling our nostrils. Dad slammed the remaining door shut above us and wedged a 2x4 through the handle, just as something massive struck the ground where we'd been standing moments before, probably a piece of farm equipment or part of somebody's roof. The cellar was pitch black and we huddled together on the damp floor, feeling around for each other in the darkness while the world above us came apart. The noise was indescribable, like being inside a blender made of thunder and breaking glass, punctuated by impacts that shook dirt loose from the ceiling onto our heads. Mom was praying out loud, the Lord's Prayer over and over, while Ashley's baby screamed himself hoarse, and the older boys clung to whoever they could reach, their fingernails digging into skin through clothing. I could taste blood in my mouth from where I'd bitten my tongue during the fall, and my ankle throbbed from landing wrong on the concrete. But all I could think about was whether that single wooden door and rusty 2x4 would hold against whatever nightmare was passing overhead. It lasted maybe 3 minutes, though it felt like 3 hours, the tornado passing directly over us with a sound I can only describe as pure destruction given voice. At one point, the door above us lifted several inches despite the 2x4, and we could see a sliver of greenish light and swirling debris before it slammed back down, the wood cracking but miraculously holding. Then, just as suddenly as it had arrived, the roar began to fade, moving away toward the east, leaving behind an eerie silence broken only by the sound of rain pattering on what was left above us and the baby's exhausted whimpers. We stayed frozen in place for another 10 minutes, nobody brave enough to speak or move, until finally Dad used his phone's flashlight to illuminate our faces, all of us covered in dirt and cobwebs, eyes wide with shock but alive, every single one of us alive. When we finally emerged from the cellar, the landscape was unrecognizable, like someone had taken our farm and put it through a giant shredder. The house was still standing but missing half its roof. Mom's kitchen exposed to the sky like a dollhouse with its front wall removed. The barn was completely gone, just a concrete foundation with some twisted metal beams pointing at odd angles. Dad's truck had been thrown into the wheat field at least 200 yards away, sitting upside down like a dead beetle. But the weirdest thing, the detail that still gives me chills when I think about it, was Mom's turkey, the one she'd been fighting with just an hour earlier, sitting perfectly intact in its roasting pan on the kitchen counter, visible through the missing wall, not even shifted an inch from where she'd left it. We ended up having Thanksgiving at a motel in town, eating Chinese takeout because every restaurant was either damaged or overwhelmed with displaced families. But we were together, and after what we'd survived, orange chicken and fried rice felt like the finest feast in the world. When you sign up for an overnight stocking shift at Save More the week before Thanksgiving, nobody tells you about the silence. Not the peaceful kind either. The kind that presses against your eardrums and makes you aware of every single sound your body produces. I needed the extra money that year, simple as that. My landlord had just raised rent by $200, and my day job doing data entry at an insurance office barely covered groceries after bills. The overnight differential was an extra $4 an hour, and they were desperate enough to hire anyone willing to work from 11 at night until 7 in the morning. I showed up for my first shift on a Wednesday in late November, 3 days before Thanksgiving, wearing the ugly green vest they issued me and steel-toed boots I borrowed from my cousin. The store manager, a tired-looking woman named Veronica with graying hair pulled into a tight bun, gave me a 10-minute tour of the back room, showed me how to use the pallet jack, and told me the freezer alarm code before disappearing into her office. She mentioned I would be alone most nights since the other stalker, some guy named Julian, had quit 2 weeks prior without notice. That should have been my first red flag. The first few hours passed without incident. I unloaded boxes of canned goods, restocked the cereal aisle, and tried not to think about how the store felt like a massive tomb once all the customers left. The fluorescent lights hummed constantly, this low electrical drone that never quite faded into the background. Around 1 in the morning, the PA system kicked on with its looping advertisement about Black Friday doorbusters, the same cheerful voice repeating the same script every 12 minutes. Save More is your destination for Black Friday savings. Join us Friday morning at 5 a.m. for doorbuster deals you cannot miss. After the 5th time hearing it, I wanted to rip the speakers out of the ceiling, but the money kept me moving, kept me stacking boxes of pasta sauce and rotating stock like Veronica had shown me. The store layout was simple enough, 12 aisles plus the produce section up front and the meat and dairy cases along the back wall. I worked methodically, starting from aisle 1 and planning to move through them all before my shift ended. By 2 in the morning, I had made it to aisle 7, the snack aisle, when I heard it for the first time. The distinct metallic rattle of a shopping cart wheel. That specific sound of a cart being pushed slowly across linoleum tile. I stopped mid-reach, a box of crackers in my hands, and listened. The sound came from somewhere toward the front of the store, near the produce section. Then it stopped. I set the box down and walked toward the end of the aisle, poking my head out to scan the front area. Nothing. Empty checkout lanes, dark register screens, and the produce misters cycling through their timed spray sequence with a soft hiss. Maybe the building was settling, I told myself. Old stores make weird noises. Pipes, ventilation systems, the refrigeration units kicking on and off. I had read somewhere that big empty spaces play tricks on your hearing, that your brain tries to fill the silence with familiar sounds. That had to be it. I walked back to my cart of stock boxes and kept working, but I kept one ear tuned to the rest of the store now. For the next 20 minutes, everything stayed quiet, except for that looping PA announcement and the buzz of the lights. Then, as I was breaking down empty cardboard boxes with my box cutter, I heard it again. The cart sound, but closer this time. Aisle 9, maybe aisle 10. The sound was deliberate, not the random rolling of a loose cart drifting on uneven floor. This was the sound of someone pushing a cart at a leisurely pace, the way shoppers do when they are browsing. I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the empty store. "Hello? Store's closed." No answer. Just that damn PA system starting up again with its Black Friday spiel. I left my boxes and walked quickly toward the back of the store where the sound had come from, my boots squeaking on the waxed floor. When I rounded the corner into aisle 9, the baking aisle, it was empty. Bags of flour and sugar stared back at me from perfectly organized shelves. No cart, no person, nothing out of place. I stood there for a moment, my pulse ticking faster than I wanted to admit, and scanned the entire aisle from one end to the other. The fluorescent lights above flickered once, a brief stutter that made the shadows jump then steadied again. I checked aisle 10 next, then aisle 11, all empty. The rational part of my brain tried to convince me I was tired, that working overnight messes with your senses, that I probably heard the sound from outside the building. Maybe someone was pushing a cart through the parking lot, returning it to the corral. But it was 2:15 in the morning on a Wednesday night in late November. Who the hell would be in the parking lot? I made my way to the front windows and pressed my face against the cold glass, cupping my hands around my eyes to block the interior light. The parking lot stretched out dark and empty under the orange glow of the streetlights. My car sat alone near the employee entrance, covered in a thin layer of frost. Not another vehicle in sight. Not a person, not a cart, nothing moving at all. I went back to work because the alternative was standing around letting my imagination run wild, and I needed this job too much to walk out over some unexplained noises. Veronica had left me a list of priority items to stock before the morning shift arrived, and I was already behind schedule. I pushed my pallet jack toward the dairy section at the back of the store, where 3 pallets of milk and yogurt waited in the walk-in cooler. The cooler door was one of those heavy industrial things with a silver handle you had to really pull to open. Inside, the temperature dropped to maybe 38 degrees, and my breath came out in visible puffs. I worked quickly, loading my flatbed cart with milk crates when I noticed something odd. One of the security cameras mounted in the corner of the cooler, the small black dome kind that usually just blend into the ceiling, had a red light blinking on it. I had been in that cooler 3 times already tonight, and I swear that light had not been on before. Security cameras do not usually have visible lights, do they? I stared at it for a moment, that little red pinpoint blinking in a steady rhythm, and felt an uncomfortable sensation crawl up my spine. Someone was watching. Had to be Veronica in her office, checking the cameras to make sure I was not slacking off. That made sense. I grabbed my loaded cart and backed out of the cooler, letting the heavy door swing shut with a pneumatic hiss. When I turned around to head back into the store proper, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. At the far end of the store, in the frozen food aisle, someone was standing completely still between the glass freezer doors. A person, definitely a person, just standing there facing in my direction. They wore dark clothing, maybe a coat or a hoodie, and they were not moving at all. Not shopping, not walking, just standing there like a mannequin. My first instinct was relief, honestly. Finally, an explanation. Someone else was in the store, probably another employee I had not been told about, or maybe a manager doing a walkthrough. But then the relief curdled into something else when I realized whoever it was had been standing there silently while I had been calling out earlier. Why had they not answered me? Why were they just standing there now, motionless in the frozen food section at 2:30 in the morning? I abandoned my cart right there in the dairy section and started walking toward them, my footsteps echoing in the quiet store. "Hey," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady and friendly. "You scared the hell out of me. Did not know anyone else was here." The figure did not move, did not respond, did not even shift their weight. As I got closer, maybe 30 feet away now, I could see they were facing directly toward me, or maybe toward the dairy section I had just come from. Their posture was rigid, arms hanging straight at their sides. The PA system chose that exact moment to crackle to life again. Save More is your destination for Black Friday savings. I stopped walking when I got about 20 feet away, close enough now to see that the person was wearing a dark blue or black hoodie with the hood pulled up. Their face was in shadow, but I could feel them looking at me. Not glancing, not casually observing, but staring with an intensity that made every instinct in my body scream at me to back away. "Can I help you with something?" I tried again, and my voice came out thinner than I intended. Still nothing. No movement, no acknowledgement, no sign they had even heard me. The frozen food cases hummed loudly in the silence that followed, their motors working overtime to keep the temperature down. I could see my reflection in the glass doors behind the figure, distorted and ghostly. That was when I noticed their hands. They were not just hanging at their sides naturally. They were clenched into tight fists, the kind of tension you see in someone who is either terrified or furious. My throat went dry. This was not right. Nothing about this was right. I took a step backward, then another, keeping my eyes on the motionless figure. They still had not moved, had not even seemed to breathe. "I'm going to call the manager," I said, louder now, trying to project authority I did not feel. "You need to leave." The figure's head tilted slowly to the left, just a few degrees, like they were considering my words. That tiny movement was somehow worse than the stillness had been. I turned and walked quickly back toward the front of the store where Veronica's office was located, my heart hammering against my ribs. I did not run because some stupid part of my pride did not want to look like I was panicking, but I definitely moved faster than a casual walk. When I reached the office door, I knocked hard 3 times. "Veronica, we have a situation." No answer. I tried the handle and found it locked. I knocked again, harder this time, my knuckles stinging against the wood. "Veronica, are you in there?" Nothing. The whole office area was dark, and when I pressed my face against the small window in the door, I could see her desk chair was empty. Her computer was off. She was gone. Had been gone, probably since shortly after I arrived. My mouth felt like sandpaper. I was completely alone in this store with whoever or whatever that was standing in the frozen food aisle. The security office was next to Veronica's office, a small room with monitors showing different camera angles throughout the store. The door was unlocked, and I practically fell into the room, slamming it behind me. 6 monitors were mounted on the wall, each one cycling through different camera feeds every few seconds. I scanned them frantically, looking for the frozen food aisle. There, camera 3. The feed showed the frozen food section from an elevated angle, giving a clear view down the entire aisle. The figure was still there, still standing in the exact same position, facing toward the camera now. Toward me. But here is what made my heart nearly stop. As I watched the monitor, the figure raised one arm slowly, mechanically, and pointed directly at the camera. Not vaguely in that direction, directly at the lens, like they knew exactly where it was, like they knew I was watching. My chair squeaked as I jerked backward, nearly tipping over. I grabbed the edge of the desk to steady myself, my eyes locked on that screen. The figure held that position, arm extended, finger pointing, for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. Then they lowered their arm and turned, walking out of frame with stiff, deliberate steps. I cycled through the other camera feeds, my fingers slipping on the controls because my palms were slick with sweat. Camera 1 showed the front entrance, empty. Camera 2 showed the produce section, empty. Camera 4 showed the checkout lanes, empty. Camera 5 showed aisle 3, empty. Camera 6 showed the back stockroom, not empty. The figure was there, standing next to the loading bay door, the same rigid posture, facing directly toward camera 6, facing toward me again. How had they moved that fast? The stockroom was on the opposite end of the store from the frozen food section. It would have taken at least 2 minutes to walk that distance, but only seconds had passed since they left frame on camera 3. I did the only thing that made sense in that moment. I pulled out my phone and called 911. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it twice before getting it to my ear. The dispatcher answered on the second ring, a woman with a calm, professional voice asking about my emergency. I tried to explain, the words tumbling out in a jumbled mess about someone in the store, someone acting strange, someone who was not supposed to be here. She asked if the person had threatened me, if they had a weapon, if I was in immediate danger. I did not know how to answer that. They had not threatened me with words, had not shown a weapon, but every fiber of my being was screaming that I was in danger. "Just send someone," I finally said, my voice cracking. "Please, just send the police." She assured me a unit was on the way and told me to stay on the line, to lock myself in a safe place and not confront the intruder. I kept my eyes on the monitors while she spoke. The figure remained in the stockroom, motionless again, that same awful stillness. Then the screen went black. Not just camera 6, all of them. Every monitor shut off simultaneously, plunging the security office into darkness except for the faint glow of my phone screen. The hum of the monitors died, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like pressure in my ears. I sat in that dark security office with the dispatcher still talking in my ear, asking if I was okay, if I was still there. I whispered that the power had gone out, that I could not see anything, and she told me to stay calm, that officers were 3 minutes away. 3 minutes felt like 3 hours. I stared at the dark monitors, my phone providing the only light, and listened. Listened for footsteps, for breathing, for that damn cart sound, for anything that would tell me where the figure was now. The store had gone completely silent. Even the PA system had stopped its loop. No fluorescent buzz, no refrigeration hum, nothing. Then I heard it. Not a cart this time, footsteps. Slow, measured footsteps in the hallway outside the security office, coming closer. The dispatcher was saying something about staying hidden, about not making noise, but I could barely process her words. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I could see the shadow of feet blocking the light from under the door frame. Someone was standing there, standing and waiting. My breath came in short, shallow gasps that I tried desperately to quiet. The door handle rattled once, tested, locked. Thank God I had locked it. The shadow remained for what might have been 30 seconds or 5 minutes. Time had lost all meaning, and then the footsteps retreated back down the hallway. I did not move, did not breathe, did not do anything except grip my phone and pray that the police would arrive before that door opened. When I finally heard sirens in the distance growing louder, approaching the store, I almost cried with relief. The footsteps had long since faded, and the store remained dark and silent. Red and blue lights began flashing through the front windows, painting the walls in alternating colors. I heard car doors slam, voices shouting, and then heavy footsteps, multiple sets, moving through the store. "Police, if anyone is in here, make yourself known." I unlocked the security office door and stumbled out into the hallway, nearly colliding with 2 officers who had their flashlights raised. They brought me outside while 3 more officers swept the building, searching every aisle, every corner, every possible hiding place. I stood in the parking lot wrapped in a blanket someone had given me, watching them work. 40 minutes later, they emerged with their report. The store was empty, no signs of forced entry. No evidence of anyone else being inside, no figure in a hoodie, nothing. They found the main breaker had been flipped off, which explained the power outage and the dead cameras, but they could not explain who had done it or why. The loading bay door in the stockroom, they told me, had been unlocked from the inside. Someone had definitely been in there. Someone had gotten in, moved through that store like they owned it, and left without a trace. The police filed a report, checked the recordings from before the cameras died, but the footage showed nothing useful. Just me working alone in empty aisles. I never went back for another shift. Veronica called me the next day, annoyed that I had abandoned my post, and I told her exactly what happened. She went quiet for a long time before saying that Julian, the guy who quit 2 weeks before me, had reported similar experiences on his last few nights. Carts moving on their own, sounds he could not explain, a feeling of being watched. She had not mentioned it during my training because she thought he was just trying to get out of his contract. I hung up on her. Savemore hired someone new within a week, and I heard through a friend of a friend that they did not last long either. Whatever was in that store, whoever was playing that sick game, I want no part of it. I took a pay cut and went back to just my day job. Some extra money is not worth that kind of terror. Finals week had just crushed me when I posted in that Riverside County Buy Nothing group, asking if anyone had a dolly I could borrow. My roommate Ivy and I were moving a busted futon out of our dorm before Thanksgiving break, and the campus maintenance guys wanted $40 just to haul it to the dumpster. $40 I definitely didn't have. I'd turned 19 3 weeks earlier, and my birthday money from my parents had already gone toward textbooks I should have bought used. The futon had been free off someone's curb back in August, so paying to get rid of it felt like some kind of cosmic joke. Within 10 minutes of posting, this guy named Connor messaged me saying he had a moving dolly and could help me load the futon into a truck if I needed. His profile looked normal enough. Pictures of him at what looked like a Padres game, a photo with an older couple who I assumed were his parents, a few shots of him hiking somewhere with red rocks in the background. He worked in IT support according to his page. 26 years old. He seemed harmless, maybe even nice for offering to help a stranger. We messaged back and forth for a few days, just logistics stuff about when I needed the dolly and whether I had access to a vehicle. He mentioned he lived pretty close to campus, just off Village Drive near that shopping center with the Trader Joe's everyone always mobbed on Sundays. Said I could swing by and grab the dolly myself, or he could drive it over and help me move the futon since it was a 2-person job anyway. I was hesitant at first because, stranger danger and all that. But Ivy was going to be with me and it was the middle of the day. Plus, this dude had like 400 friends on Facebook, and photos going back years. Serial killers don't usually maintain that kind of social media presence, right? That's what I told myself anyway. We settled on Wednesday afternoon, November 9th. He'd meet me at my dorm. We'd load up the futon in his truck and he'd help me dump it. Simple, free. I even felt a little guilty for being suspicious of someone just trying to be helpful. Wednesday morning, Ivy texted me that she'd gotten called in for an emergency shift at the campus library. Some girl had quit without notice, and they were desperate. Ivy needed the hours anyway, so I told her not to worry about it. I'd just meet Connor myself, get the futon loaded, and be done in 30 minutes tops. When he pulled up in a blue Toyota Tacoma around 2 in the afternoon, he looked exactly like his photos. Average height, brown hair, wearing a gray hoodie and jeans. He had this friendly, easygoing smile, and immediately started apologizing for not bringing the dolly after all. Said he'd forgotten it was actually his roommate's, and the guy had taken it to help his girlfriend move that same day. Total coincidence, super sorry, but he had moving straps in his truck that would work even better for a futon. The way he said it was so casual and apologetic that I didn't think twice. We carried the futon down 3 flights of stairs, and yeah, those straps actually did make it easier. He kept making jokes about how this thing probably weighed more than both of us combined and asking what the hell futons were even stuffed with. Concrete mix? I laughed. He seemed genuinely funny, not creepy at all. When we got the futon loaded in his truck bed, he asked if I wanted to grab coffee after we dumped it. Said there was a good place near his apartment and he'd buy since I was a broke college student and he remembered those days. I almost said yes because honestly, he'd just helped me haul furniture for free and seemed like a decent person. But something made me hesitate, not in a scared way, more in a, I have a ton of studying to do and I look like garbage right now way. I told him maybe another time. I really had to hit the books. He didn't push it at all, just said no problem and asked where the dumpster was. I directed him to the big waste area behind the dining hall. But when we got there, he frowned and said the dumpster was completely full, which it was. There was already furniture and trash piled around it. He suggested we could take it to the actual dump site across town, but that would cost a fee. Or, he said, he had storage space in his apartment complex where we could leave it temporarily, and he'd deal with it later. He lived 5 minutes away. It seemed reasonable. I'd already taken up so much of his time. I said, sure, that would be great. Thank you so much. He smiled that same friendly smile, and we drove toward Village Drive. His apartment complex was one of those newer builds with the fake stone facades and names that try to sound fancy. Parkside Terrace or Parkview Terrace, something like that, even though there wasn't a park anywhere near it. He pulled into a spot and said the storage area was actually in the basement near his unit. Easier to just go through his place than walk all the way around the building. Made sense. I followed him up an exterior staircase to the second floor. The hallway smelled like someone had burned popcorn recently and was trying to cover it with air freshener. He unlocked his door, number 2G, and held it open for me to walk in first. The apartment was weirdly clean, like suspiciously clean for a 26-year-old guy living alone. No dishes in the sink, no clutter, everything organized. Beige couch, glass coffee table, flat screen mounted on the wall. A few framed prints of generic landscape photos. It looked like a staged apartment in a rental ad. He walked past me toward what I assumed was the storage closet or basement access, and I heard the door click shut behind me. Not slam, just that soft, final click of a door closing on its own. I turned around and tried the handle. Locked. The kind of lock that needed a key from the inside too. One of those deadbolts. My heart started doing this weird flutter thing, but I kept my voice normal when I asked him if the door locked automatically. He was standing in the kitchen area now, maybe 10 feet away, and he looked at me with this completely calm expression. Said, yeah, it's a security feature. Lots of apartments have them now. Fire hazard though, he added, almost like it was a joke. Then he asked if I wanted water or anything. His voice was still friendly, still casual, but something had shifted in the air. I couldn't pinpoint what exactly. I said, no thanks, I really should get going soon. I had a study group at 4. He nodded slowly and said, sure. But then he asked me if I'd noticed anything weird about our conversations. The way he said, our conversations, made my spine go rigid. Plural, like there had been more than just the Facebook messages. I told him I didn't know what he meant. My phone was in my back pocket and I was calculating how fast I could unlock it and dial 911 if I needed to. He walked toward the couch and picked up his laptop from the coffee table, opened it, and turned the screen toward me. It was our Facebook message thread. All of it. Screenshots going back to that first day I'd posted about the dolly. But there were other screenshots too, ones I didn't recognize. Photos of me walking across campus, me sitting outside the student union with my coffee, me and Ivy at the dining hall. My throat went completely dry. He scrolled down and there were more. Text messages. My text messages. Conversations I'd had with Ivy, with my mom, with a guy named Troy from my biology class who I'd been casually texting. Messages I'd sent from my phone. Private messages. He'd been reading everything. He asked me, in that same calm voice, if I knew how easy it was to clone someone's phone data, if you had the right software. Said he worked in IT, like I knew. And it was honestly scary how much access people didn't realize they were giving away. When I'd clicked on that link he'd sent me last week, the one that was supposed to be photos of his truck so I'd recognize it, that's all it took. One click. He had everything. I couldn't form words for a second. My brain was trying to process what he was showing me, what he was saying. He'd been reading my texts for over a week. He knew where I went, who I talked to, what I said in private. He knew Ivy wasn't coming today because he'd read her text to me that morning. He'd planned this. The dolly, the dumpster being full, all of it. My voice came out shaky when I asked him what he wanted, why he was doing this. He closed the laptop and set it down gently, then sat on the arm of the couch. Said he wasn't doing anything, really, just wanted to meet me in person, have a real conversation without all the performance people do online. He said I seemed interesting, genuine, not like other girls who were obsessed with their image. He'd been watching my social media for months, actually, since before I even posted in that group. Saw me comment on something back in September and started following my activity. He knew my schedule, my major, where I like to eat lunch. The Facebook post about the futon was just a perfect opportunity. He called it serendipity. I wanted to throw up. I forced myself to stay calm even though every instinct was screaming at me to panic. I asked him, as steadily as I could manage, to please unlock the door so I could leave. Told him I wouldn't tell anyone about any of this. I just wanted to go home. He tilted his head like he was considering it, then said he would, absolutely. But he wanted to show me one more thing first. He pulled out his phone and opened a recording app, pressed play. It was my voice from 20 minutes ago in his truck, talking about my studying, laughing at his jokes about the futon. Then my voice from earlier in the week, audio from a phone call I'd had with my mom about Thanksgiving plans. He'd recorded everything, every conversation we'd had in person, every phone call I'd made in the past week. He said he liked to keep records, to document connections. Made them more real somehow, more permanent. He looked genuinely proud of himself, like he'd shown me something impressive rather than absolutely terrifying. That's when I realized he genuinely didn't think he was doing anything wrong. In his mind, this was normal. This was just him being thorough, being interested. That scared me more than anything else, that total disconnect. My hand moved to my pocket, but he noticed immediately. Told me not to bother with my phone because he'd disabled my cellular connection remotely about 5 minutes ago. Could turn it back on whenever he wanted. He said it so matter-of-factly, like he was explaining how to use a coffee maker. Then he stood up and walked closer to me, not threatening, just casual, and said we should sit down and talk for real. Get to know each other without screens between us. He'd made tea earlier, it was probably still warm. The way he was acting, like this was a normal social interaction, like I was a guest who'd come over willingly, made my skin feel wrong on my body. I backed up until I hit the door. Told him I really needed to leave right now. My voice cracked on the last word. He sighed, and for the first time, he looked annoyed, said I was being dramatic, that he wasn't going to hurt me, he just wanted to talk. Why was everyone always so paranoid these days? He gestured toward the couch again, more insistent this time. Sit down, please. I didn't sit. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I started talking. Told him okay, I'd stay and talk, but could I please just let someone know where I am first? Ivy would worry if I didn't check in. He considered this, then said no. That would defeat the purpose. Nobody else needed to know about our time together. This was private, but I kept pushing, kept my voice as calm as I could. Said if I didn't text Ivy in the next 10 minutes, she'd already know something was wrong because we had a system. We always told each other where we were. Complete lie, but I sold it. Told him she knew I was here at Parkside Terrace, apartment 2G, with someone named Connor from the Facebook group. His expression changed slightly. That annoyed look turned into something more calculating. He asked when I'd told her that. I said this morning before Ivy left for work. Texted her his address just in case. Another lie, but a good one. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him working through the implications. If I was telling the truth, someone knew exactly where I was. Someone who would notice if I disappeared. He walked back to the kitchen area, put some distance between us, and I watched him think. The apartment was completely silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Finally, he said, fine. He'd let me go, but I needed to delete all our Facebook messages first, right now in front of him. And I couldn't tell anyone about the phone cloning or the recordings. If I did, he'd release every private message I'd ever sent to everyone I knew. My family, my professors, everyone. He had them all backed up in multiple places. He said this without any emotion, like he was negotiating a business deal. I agreed immediately. Took out my phone, which suddenly had service again, and deleted our entire message thread while he watched. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely tap the screen correctly. But I got it done. He seemed satisfied. Walked to the door, unlocked it with a key from his pocket, and opened it. Told me it was nice meeting me in person. Hoped we could stay in touch. I didn't respond. Just walked out of that apartment as fast as I could without running, down the stairs, across the parking lot, and I didn't stop moving until I was 6 blocks away. I called Ivy from a Target parking lot and told her everything. She wanted me to go to the police immediately, but I was terrified of what he'd do with those messages if I reported him. Some of them were embarrassing. Private stuff I'd said about people, complaints about professors, personal things about my family. The idea of everyone seeing those made me feel sick, but Ivy convinced me we at least needed to document what happened, even if I didn't file charges right away. We went to campus police together that evening. I brought my phone, showed them the deleted Facebook messages that were still in my archive, explained about the cloned data and the recordings. The officer who took my report was this older woman, Officer Stephanie Reeves, and she didn't dismiss me or act like I was overreacting. She said this was illegal on multiple levels: unauthorized access to electronic communications, stalking, false imprisonment. She explained that even if he had my messages, releasing them as revenge would be another crime, and that he'd be facing serious charges already. That helped. Knowing he'd actually committed crimes, that this wasn't just me being paranoid or dramatic like he'd said. Campus police contacted the local department, and they got a warrant for his apartment within 48 hours. Turns out I wasn't the first person Connor had done this to. They found data from 3 other women on his laptop, all college students from the area, all people he'd connected with through various online groups over the past 2 years. None of them had reported him because he'd used the same leverage on them, threatened to release private information if they told anyone. One girl had graduated and moved to Arizona specifically to get away from him. The detectives found recording equipment, backup drives, printed photos, everything meticulously organized in folders with our names on them. He'd built an entire system. Connor was arrested and charged with multiple felonies, including wiretapping, computer fraud, stalking, and unlawful restraint. His bail was set high enough that he couldn't pay it. The prosecutor told me he'd likely take a plea deal to avoid trial. And he did. 18 months in county jail, followed by 3 years probation, mandatory counseling, and a permanent restraining order. He's also a registered offender now in the state database. I grew up in a quiet town tucked between old coal hills and maple woods in Pennsylvania, the kind of place where everyone knows whose truck that is by the sound of its engine. Back then, I was working part-time at a diner off the main road, pulling double shifts before Thanksgiving week. My nights usually ended around 11, walking home with the cold biting through my jacket and that faint smell of fuel always drifting from Murphy's Auto Repair down the street. Murphy's had been there forever. A squat gray building with a single flickering sign and 3 gas pumps that hardly worked in the winter. That night, just after midnight, I was sitting in my kitchen reheating leftovers when the sound hit. A deep, violent crack that made the window panes flex. For a second I thought a plane had gone down or something exploded in the hills. The lights flickered once, then the world outside glowed orange through the frost on the glass. I ran out barefoot, the air thick with the chemical tang of burning rubber and gasoline. From the corner of Maple Street, I could see flames clawing up the side of Murphy's garage like they were alive. People started spilling out of their houses, shouting names, pulling on coats. The volunteer fire trucks arrived fast. This town might be small, but everyone took pride in showing up when it mattered. The air was chaos, sparks popping, hoses hissing, and the low roar of fire devouring metal. I remember seeing old Tom Murphy himself, standing across the street in his slippers, just staring. He didn't say a word, didn't move toward the building, even when one of the firefighters yelled his name. It struck me as strange, his silence, the way he clutched a set of keys like he couldn't let go. By the time the flames were finally out, the garage looked like a skeleton. The smell was unbearable, something between melted plastic and diesel smoke. Everyone assumed it was some kind of electrical issue or maybe a gas leak, but the firefighters seemed uneasy. They taped off the whole area and kept the rest of us back. Around 2 in the morning, I overheard one of them muttering that they'd found signs someone had been siphoning fuel from the underground tanks. That part didn't make sense. Hardly anyone in town even knew how to open those access caps, let alone pull gas from them. The next morning, the whole town felt different. You could smell the burned rubber half a mile away, and the air had that weird stillness that comes after something big happens. Everyone had a theory. Some said it was teenagers fooling around. Others whispered about insurance money. When I went to grab breakfast at the diner, half the customers were talking about the fire like it was a movie they'd all seen from different angles. Then Tom Murphy walked in, looking like he hadn't slept at all. His face was pale, his hand still stained with soot, but what caught my attention was how calm he seemed, almost rehearsed, like he was already telling a story he'd practiced all night. He sat at the counter and told the waitress that his security cameras had malfunctioned earlier that evening, that the system had automatically wiped the footage before the explosion. No one said anything for a second. You could hear the ceiling fan turning. Then someone asked if he'd called his insurance company, and he just nodded slowly, staring into his coffee. Something about it didn't sit right with me. Murphy wasn't the kind of guy who believed in coincidences, but he kept repeating that word, accidentally, like he wanted to convince himself more than anyone else. That night, I couldn't sleep. The smell of gas seemed stronger in my house than it had any right to be, even with the windows closed. I kept thinking about the timing, how the cameras went down hours before the fire, how he'd been standing across the street without a single burn, holding those keys. Around 1 a.m., I put on my jacket and walked back toward the site. The fire trucks were gone, but the tape still fluttered in the wind. The metal was still warm when I got close enough to feel it radiating through my jeans. A few stray tools were scattered in the gravel, a socket wrench, a glove, and an old siphon pump lying half melted near the fence. While I was standing there, a pickup turned the corner, its headlights sweeping across the debris. I recognized it right away. It belonged to a guy named Eli who used to work at Murphy's before quitting last spring. He slowed down when he saw me, rolled his window halfway, and asked what I was doing there. His voice sounded rough, almost defensive. I told him I was just looking, couldn't sleep. He nodded once and said, "Some folks shouldn't dig too deep, kid," before driving off. His words stuck with me the whole walk home, echoing louder than the wind. 2 days later, the investigators showed up from the state fire marshal's office. They parked a white van by the curb and spent hours digging through the rubble while half the town watched from the sidewalk. By noon, rumors were already flying. Someone claimed they'd found tire tracks leading into the back lot. Someone else swore they'd seen Murphy at the shop late the night before the explosion. The weirdest part? Every time someone mentioned the missing footage, Murphy brushed it off like it was no big deal. Said the system had been acting up for months. But when I asked one of the firefighters if that was true, he frowned and said, "Funny thing, I helped install those cameras last summer. They were brand new." That evening, the town's power went out for almost an hour. I sat on my porch, listening to the faint hum of generators kicking in around the neighborhood. The darkness made me uneasy, not just because of the fire, but because everything suddenly felt too quiet. I could see the outline of the ruined shop down the block, barely visible against the sky. For a second, I thought I saw movement inside the wreck, like someone holding a flashlight. But when I blinked, it was gone. A minute later, a car door slammed somewhere, and I caught a whiff of gasoline, sharp and raw. By morning, the news spread that someone had broken into the taped-off area during the night. The police said nothing was taken, but one of the inspector's toolboxes had been opened and left half submerged in the puddles near the pumps. When I passed by, I noticed fresh footprints leading away toward the woods behind the lot. The mud was deep from last night's rain, but you could see the tread marks clearly. Heavy boots, definitely a man's. What unsettled me most was the pattern. It looked like he'd been pacing, going back and forth between the tanks before finally disappearing into the trees. That same afternoon, I ran into Eli again at the gas station near the highway. He looked exhausted, eyes red like he hadn't slept. He asked if people were still talking about the explosion, and when I said yes, he sighed and muttered, "Murphy shouldn't have kept those drums down there." I asked what he meant, but he just stared at the counter for a long time, tapping his thumb against the register. Then he whispered, he knew what was leaking. He just didn't want to pay to fix it. Before I could say anything else, he grabbed his pack of cigarettes and left without looking back. That night, I couldn't shake what Eli said. I went down to the public records office the next day during my lunch break to check something. Murphy's auto had been cited twice that year for unsafe fuel storage, both times marked as unresolved. The inspector's notes mentioned corrosion around the underground tanks and the possibility of vapor leaks. The realization hit me hard. Maybe whoever was siphoning gas wasn't just stealing. Maybe they were trying to drain it before something worse happened. But if that were true, why erase the footage? Why pretend nothing was wrong? A week later, heavy rain washed most of the debris away, but the smell of fuel still lingered. People started moving on, decorating for the holidays, pretending life was back to normal. Murphy reopened what was left of the office to handle paperwork, but it looked more like he was packing to leave town. One afternoon, I saw him loading boxes into a rented van, eyes darting up and down the street. When he noticed me watching, he waved, a stiff, nervous gesture, then disappeared inside. That was the last time I saw him. By morning, the van and the sign from the front lot were both gone. Months passed before anyone heard anything new. Then, in the spring, workers digging a new drainage line behind the old shop uncovered a buried drum, one of those industrial-grade fuel containers, rusted through and leaking sludge into the dirt. The city had to call in an environmental crew to contain it. I stopped by while they were working, curious, and one of the guys mentioned there were initials burned into the metal cap. TM, Tom Murphy. When I asked if it was recent, he shook his head. Old, real old, probably buried before those pumps were even installed. No one ever saw Murphy again. Some said he moved down south. Others whispered that he never left, that he'd built those tanks himself years ago and the ground finally caught up to him. Every now and then when the wind blows from that direction, you can still smell it, that faint sting of gasoline in the cold air. I don't know if it's my imagination or something seeping out from underground, but I swear, every time it hits, I can almost hear that explosion again, echoing through the hills like the towns trying to remind us we never really knew what burned that night. I'd gone up to my parents' lake house that weekend mostly to clear my head. They'd retired to Florida a few years ago, but the place in northern Wisconsin was still standing, quiet, still, and tucked between rows of pine trees that swayed like they were whispering to each other. I worked remotely then, designing websites, and I'd been running on caffeine and no sleep for weeks. That little gray cabin felt like the perfect spot to just disconnect, make some soup, maybe read by the fireplace. The lake was half frozen already, the kind of dull silver that reflected nothing back. You could walk outside and hear nothing except the creak of the dock or a crow in the distance. It was peaceful in a way that felt almost heavy. The first morning I noticed the footprints, I didn't think much of them. They started near the tree line and ended right at the edge of the porch, big enough to belong to a grown man but smeared like someone had stepped in mud and dragged their heel. The ground around the lake gets soft after it rains, and I figured maybe a raccoon or stray dog had wandered through and messed up the pattern. Still, it looked weird. The shape wasn't pawed or split, just human, barefoot too. It was November, and the nights dropped below freezing, so that should have been impossible. I remember squatting down, touching the edge of one print, and feeling how crisp the outline was. It hadn't frozen yet, meaning it was fresh. The next day there were more. Same path, same ending, right at the back porch steps. That morning I made coffee and tried to laugh about it, texting my friend Leah a picture with the caption, "Guess I've got a Bigfoot fan." She told me to buy a trail cam and joked that I'd make the news. But there was something about the way the print stopped exactly at the door that started to bother me. It was too deliberate, like someone was walking up and turning back over and over just before reaching the house. I checked the locks twice that night, even though the nearest neighbor was over half a mile away. That evening I curled up on the couch with a blanket, watching the light from the TV flicker across the windows. The lake outside looked like a dark sheet of glass, and every now and then, the old dock moaned as if something heavy shifted against it. Around midnight, I turned the TV off and walked into the kitchen for some water. That's when the motion light outside blinked on, bright, sudden, cutting across the back porch. I froze halfway through the room, staring through the glass door, expecting to see a deer or a raccoon scurrying off. But behind the patio chairs, half hidden by the shadows, was a shape. Someone crouched low, hands pressed against the decking, just waiting. I didn't move for what felt like a full minute. The light buzzed softly, throwing harsh white against the glass, and that shape stayed perfectly still. My first thought was that it had to be a prank, maybe some local kid or a hunter lost from the trails. But the longer I watched, the clearer it became that whoever it was knew I could see them. Their head tilted slightly, like they were studying the reflection, trying to figure out if I was standing there or not. My pulse started thudding in my ears. I reached for my phone on the counter, but the second I turned my body, the light clicked off, plunging everything into black again. When it came back on, nothing. The porch was empty, no footprints visible through the glass, just the soft hiss of wind rolling off the lake. I barely slept that night. Every sound, the groan of the floorboards, the distant pop of ice shifting near the dock, had me sitting upright, listening. At around 3 in the morning, I finally dozed off on the couch with the lamp still on. When I woke up, the footprints were there again, but this time they circled the porch twice before stopping at the door. Whoever it was had come back after the light went off. I called Leah and told her, trying to sound casual, but my voice kept catching. She offered to drive up, but I told her I'd be fine. It was broad daylight, and nothing ever really happens out there, right? By afternoon, I convinced myself it had been some weird coincidence. Maybe a fisherman cutting through the woods, someone curious about the cabin. I tried to work, but I kept glancing out the window every few minutes. Around sunset, I took the flashlight and stepped outside for the first time since the night before. The air was biting cold. The prints were still there, but they stopped abruptly near the deck railing, as if the person had just vanished. I followed them with my light, and about 10 feet into the trees, I found a crumpled soda can and a torn strip of fabric caught on a branch. It looked like part of a flannel shirt, faded red. I pocketed it without thinking, then regretted it the moment I got back inside. That night, I kept the living room light on and sat near the window, waiting. It was almost 1 a.m. when the motion light snapped on again, flooding the porch. My breath caught when I saw the figure back in the same spot, crouched low, one hand gripping the leg of the patio chair. This time, he lifted his head slowly, just enough for the light to catch his face. His skin looked pale like wet paper, and his mouth hung slightly open. But his eyes were what froze me. He wasn't looking at the door. He was staring directly at the side window where I was sitting. The light flicked off again after a few seconds, and in that brief darkness, I swear I heard the boards creak under his weight, moving closer. I backed away from the window and grabbed my keys, but my hands felt useless. Every sound in that house seemed amplified. I locked myself in the bathroom, sat on the cold tile, and tried to calm down. After what felt like forever, I forced myself to peek through the blinds again. The light outside was still off, but the chairs on the porch had shifted. One was turned toward the door, like someone had dragged it an inch closer. I didn't hear a car, no crunch of footsteps leaving through the trees. It was just gone. I called the sheriff's office, explained that someone was prowling around the property, and the dispatcher said they'd send a car from the nearest town. It was a long 20 minutes before headlights appeared on the dirt road. When the deputy arrived, he checked the porch with his flashlight, then the yard, and finally the dock. There were prints everywhere now, fresh ones overlapping the old. He asked if anyone else had a key, and I told him only my parents did, and they were in Florida. He suggested I stay somewhere else for the night. I packed a bag so fast I nearly forgot my laptop. Before leaving, I glanced once more through the window. The motion light flicked on again, even though neither of us was outside. The deputy frowned, stepped onto the porch, and waved his arm in front of the sensor. Nothing. It stayed on until we pulled out of the driveway. The next morning, I drove back with him to grab the rest of my stuff. The light was off now, and the prints had filled with frost. The chairs were back in their original place, perfectly aligned. Nothing looked disturbed. But when I opened the door, the smell hit first. Mud and something metallic, like rain mixed with rust. On the kitchen counter, next to the coffee maker, was the strip of red flannel I'd pocketed from the woods. It wasn't damp anymore. It was folded neatly in half, placed right beside my mug. I don't know how to explain it because I'd left that piece in the glove compartment of my car. I never went back after that. My parents eventually sold the house, and I didn't argue. Every now and then when I visit a lakeside cabin or see motion lights flicker through the trees, that same cold rush hits me. The memory of that still figure crouched behind the furniture, waiting for me to turn the lights off. I still wonder if he'd been watching longer than I realized, stepping closer each night, stopping just short of the door. Maybe he was waiting for me to step outside first. It was the tail end of Black Friday, and the store looked like a battlefield that had just been evacuated. I worked the late shift at a mid-sized retail chain in northern Illinois, mostly handling restocks and cleanup after the madness. The kind of place that sold everything from kitchenware to cheap electronics. I'd been there for 2 years, juggling night classes during the week and surviving on vending machine coffee. That night, most of the crew clocked out around midnight, leaving just me and Mark, the night manager, to finish loading the shelves before the morning crew came in. The hum of the fluorescent lights had a way of getting into your head after a while. Constant, dull, like a mosquito you can't find. Every now and then one of them flickered overhead, and the shadows on the linoleum seemed to shift with it. The air was still heavy with that mix of burnt coffee, cardboard dust, and cheap plastic. I had a pallet full of Bluetooth speakers to move to the back room, and as I rolled it across the empty aisles, the sound of the wheels echoed far louder than it should have. It was the first time all day the store had gone completely silent. Near the customer service counter, we had a set of monitors that displayed the security camera feeds. I glanced at them mostly out of habit, checking if Mark was still in the stockroom or sneaking another cigarette out back. But one of the screens caught my eye. The feed from the electronics section, aisle 9, showed movement, a tall figure walking slowly between the shelves. At first, I thought it was a delayed playback from earlier in the day. Those cameras glitched sometimes after a long shift. But the timestamp in the corner was live. 12:47 a.m. I radioed Mark to ask if he was in the electronics section, but his muffled reply came from the back. He hadn't left the stockroom. My gut told me maybe someone got locked in after closing. Maybe a customer hiding out. It happened before. A drunk college kid once fell asleep in the patio furniture display. So I grabbed my flashlight and headed that way, trying to make as much noise as possible so whoever it was would know I was coming. The closer I got, the louder that hum from the lights seemed to buzz in my ears, until the sound almost felt alive. When I turned the corner into aisle 9, the first thing I noticed was how cold it felt compared to the rest of the store. Not a normal kind of cold, more like the air conditioning had kicked on just for that section. My footsteps echoed sharply off the polished floor as I scanned the shelves with my flashlight. Rows of headphones, phone chargers, empty boxes, and not a single sound except the faint electric hum above me. I called out, "Hey, store's closed, you can't be back here." My voice bounced through the aisles, but no one answered. I stood still for a moment, listening. Somewhere, faintly, a display TV flickered to life, playing static. I checked behind every end cap, even crouched to look under the shelves, thinking maybe someone was messing around. Nothing. When I walked back toward the service counter, I glanced up at the camera dome above aisle 9 and saw the red light still blinking. It was recording. Back at the monitor wall, I rewound the feed a few seconds, expecting to see myself searching with the flashlight. Instead, I watched something step out from behind the shelves just after I'd passed through. It wasn't clear, more like a shape outlined by the weak light, but it moved slow, deliberate, like it was waiting for me to turn around. I froze in place for a good 10 seconds, staring at the grainy footage. The figure leaned forward into the aisle as if studying the camera. Then, without warning, the feed glitched, jumping from static to a frozen frame. The timestamp froze too. 12:58 a.m. Every other monitor stayed normal, except that one. I remember tapping the screen like that would somehow fix it, but before I could decide whether to check again, the motion alert went off. A loud digital beep echoed from the console, and the same alert icon blinked over aisle 9 again and again. Mark came out from the stockroom after hearing the noise. I told him someone might still be in the store, and he laughed at first, until he saw the blinking monitor. We both stood there watching the frozen frame for what felt like a full minute. Then, as if the system had caught up, the image flickered back to life, showing the empty aisle. Every box, every shelf untouched. Mark muttered something about cheap wiring and told me to lock up early, but I wasn't ready to leave. I wanted to make sure that thing, whatever it was, wasn't still walking around in there. Mark headed to the front to shut off the lights while I did one last sweep. I rolled my cart past toys, clothes, cleaning supplies, all fine. But when I approached the electronics section again, the motion sensor above aisle 9 clicked on, and the lights there blinked to full brightness. I stood still, staring down the long stretch of shelves. The air felt heavier now, like the store itself was holding its breath. I took a few slow steps forward, the wheels of my cart squeaking against the floor, until I reached the middle of the aisle. That's when I noticed one of the display phones had been lifted off its stand. The cord hung loose, the plastic bracket swinging slightly side to side. I called out for Mark, but the lights overhead flickered at the exact moment I did. In that half-second of darkness, I saw a movement at the far end. Something tall, pale, stepping just enough into view to make out the silhouette. I shouted again, louder this time, and the lights came back fully on. The aisle was empty. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight pointed ahead. The motion sensor behind me clicked off and the lights dimmed again, one by one, in a sequence like a wave pulling back into the ocean. By the time I reached the service counter, Mark was already turning the key in the front door. I told him what I'd seen, what I thought I'd seen, but he just shook his head, said I was overtired. We clocked out, and I lingered outside the glass entrance for a minute. From the parking lot, I could see the reflection of the camera lights blinking inside. Only one stayed steady, the red one above aisle 9. It was supposed to turn off automatically when the system went into night mode. That light just kept glowing. The next morning, I came back early, before my shift, and checked the footage again. Every recording from 12:45 to 1:05 was gone, corrupted, according to the system. But the strange part wasn't the missing video. It was the audio file attached to it. 30 minutes of silence, then a faint voice whispering my name. Not yelling, not calling, just whispering it over and over. The IT guy said the file must have glitched during compression. I quit a week later. But every year when Black Friday rolls around, I still hear that same hum in my head, like those lights are waiting for me to come back. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Nobody tells you how loud silence can be, until you find yourself surrounded by nothing but frozen emptiness. My name is irrelevant now, but what happened to me in March 2018 changed everything about how I understand survival, fear, and the absolute indifference of nature. At 34, fresh off a divorce that had gutted my savings and my sense of self, I had taken a contract job with a telecommunications company installing satellite equipment in remote Alaskan villages. The pay was exceptional, the kind of money that made you overlook the fact that you would be flying in tiny aircraft over landscapes that looked like they belonged on another planet. I had grown up in suburban Minnesota, spent my 20s chasing a career in network engineering, and somehow ended up agreeing to spend 6 weeks bouncing between communities that most Americans could not find on a map. The irony of running away from one kind of isolation straight into another was not lost on me. But desperation makes you brave in stupid ways. The morning of the crash started like any other workday in that strange chapter of my life. I woke up at 5 in the morning in a small motel in Bethel, a hub town in southwestern Alaska that served as my base of operations. The room smelled like industrial cleaner and stale coffee, and frost had crystallized on the inside of the single window, despite the heater running all night. My pilot for the day was a guy named Dean Archer, a wiry man in his early 50s with sun-damaged skin and the kind of calm demeanor that either meant he was incredibly competent or completely checked out. He had been flying bush routes for over 2 decades, and when I met him at the airstrip that morning, he was already doing his pre-flight check on a Cessna 185 that looked like it had seen better days. The paint was faded, patches of primer showing through in spots, but Dean assured me she was mechanically sound. We were headed to a village called Akiak, about 40 miles northeast, then continuing to 2 other communities before looping back. The whole trip was supposed to take 6 hours, weather permitting. We took off around 7:30, just as the sun was beginning to paint the horizon in shades of pale orange and pink. From the air, the Alaskan tundra in late winter is something that defies description. An endless white canvas broken only by dark ribbons of frozen rivers, and the occasional cluster of spruce trees that looked like black needles poking through a bedsheet. Dean was not much of a talker, which suited me fine. He communicated in short bursts, pointing out landmarks, mentioning changes in weather patterns, occasionally adjusting the radio to check in with other pilots in the area. The Cessna hummed along steadily, and despite the cramped quarters and the constant vibration that made my teeth feel loose, I found myself relaxing into the rhythm of the flight. We completed the first 2 stops without incident, me hauling my equipment cases through snow that came up to my knees, Dean smoking cigarettes by the plane, and chatting with locals who seemed to know him by name. By early afternoon, we were headed to our final destination before turning back, a village called Tuluxac that sat along the Kuskokwim River. That is when the engine coughed. It was a sound so subtle that I almost missed it, a brief stutter in the constant drone that had become background noise. Dean's reaction told me everything I needed to know. His hands tightened on the yoke, and his eyes flicked to the instrument panel with an intensity that had been absent all day. He did not say anything at first, just started flipping switches and adjusting controls with movements that were quick but deliberate. The engine coughed again, longer this time, and the plane shuddered in a way that made my stomach clench. We were flying over a stretch of wilderness that had no villages, no roads, nothing but white emptiness stretching to the horizon in every direction. Dean grabbed the radio and started transmitting our position, his voice steady but urgent, using terminology I did not fully understand. I remember looking out the window and seeing the shadow of our plane skating across the snow below, and thinking how small we were, how insignificant against that vast frozen landscape. The engine sputtered a 3rd time, then died completely, and the sudden silence was the most terrifying sound I've ever heard. Dean became a different person in those moments. The laid-back pilot who had been cracking dry jokes about moose and complaining about his ex-wife transformed into something mechanical, precise, almost robotic. He told me to tighten my seatbelt and brace for impact, his voice flat and controlled, like he was reading from a manual. The Cessna became a glider, the only sounds now the wind rushing past the fuselage and the creak of the airframe as Dean fought to maintain control. He was looking for a place to land, scanning the terrain below with desperate focus. But there was nothing. No frozen lakes flat enough, no clearings wide enough, just rolling hills of snow and clusters of willows, and the occasional boulder poking through like a gray tooth. I remember praying, something I had not done since childhood, bargaining with a God I was not sure I believed in. The ground rushed up at us with sickening speed, and Dean pulled back on the yoke, trying to flatten our descent. We clipped something, a buried log, a snowdrift, I never found out, and the plane spun violently to the left. The world became a tumbling chaos of white and gray, and the shriek of metal tearing apart. The impact itself is fragmented in my memory, broken into snapshots that do not quite connect. I remember the windshield exploding inward, a spray of glass and snow and cold air hitting my face. I remember the sensation of being thrown forward against my restraint so hard that the breath was crushed out of my lungs. I remember a sound like a giant crumpling a tin can, and then a sharp, blinding pain in my left leg that made me scream. When everything stopped moving, I was hanging sideways in my seat, the plane resting at an angle with the crumpled nose buried in a snowbank. Blood was dripping somewhere. I could hear it, a soft pattering sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden stillness. My vision swam in and out of focus, and for a long moment I just hung there, trying to understand what had happened, trying to remember how to breathe. The cold was already seeping in through the shattered windshield, a cold so intense it felt like being stabbed with thousands of tiny needles. I turned my head to look at Dean, and that is when I saw that he was not moving. His body slumped forward against the yoke, a dark stain spreading across the snow beneath his door. Getting out of that seatbelt took what felt like an eternity. My fingers were already going numb, fumbling with the release mechanism while my legs screamed in protest every time I shifted my weight. When I finally got free, I half fell, half crawled toward Dean, dragging myself across the tilted cabin floor that was now slick with hydraulic fluid and melting snow. Up close, I could see the damage, A piece of the instrument panel had broken loose during impact and caught him in the chest, and there was so much blood soaking through his jacket that I knew before I even checked for a pulse. Dean Archer, who had flown these routes for 23 years, who had told me just that morning about his daughter's wedding coming up in June, was dead. I sat there in the wreckage next to his body, shivering uncontrollably, my breath coming out in ragged white clouds, and I felt something inside me threaten to crack wide open, but the cold would not let me grieve. It demanded action, demanded movement, demanded that I focus on the only thing that mattered now, not dying in this frozen nowhere alongside a man I had known for less than 8 hours. I forced myself to assess the situation with whatever clarity I could muster through the shock and the pain. My left leg was badly injured. I could see the bone pressing against the skin just below my knee, not broken through but close, the whole limb swelling rapidly and turning colors that legs should not turn. I had cuts on my face and hands from the shattered windshield, and my ribs ached in a way that suggested at least one was cracked. The plane was destroyed beyond any hope of repair, but the fuselage was mostly intact, which meant shelter of a sort. Outside, the temperature was somewhere around 15 below zero, and the sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon. In March, this far north, we only had maybe 5 hours of usable daylight left. I crawled to the back of the cabin where my equipment cases had been stored and found them scattered and broken open, satellite components and tools strewn everywhere. But underneath the wreckage, I found my backpack with a spare jacket, 2 granola bars, a thermos of coffee that was somehow still intact, and a cigarette lighter I had been carrying even though I quit smoking 3 years prior. Not much, not nearly enough, but something. The hours that followed exist in my memory as a blur of pain, cold, and desperate improvisation. I knew from the survival training the company had given us, a half-day seminar that I'd mostly slept through, that staying with the aircraft was the right call. The wreckage would be easier for search teams to spot than a single person wandering through the wilderness, and the fuselage offered at least some protection from the wind that had started to pick up, driving the temperature even lower. I used pieces of torn insulation in my spare jacket to plug the hole where the windshield had been, working with fingers that had lost most of their feeling, cursing and crying and talking to myself just to fill the terrible silence. Dean's body was still in the pilot seat, and I could not bring myself to move him, so I just tried not to look in that direction. The radio was destroyed, crushed in the impact along with most of the instrument panel. I found the emergency locator transmitter under the rear seat, but the casing was cracked, and the indicator light that should have been blinking was dark and dead. Our last known position had been transmitted before we went down, but Dean had been in the middle of giving coordinates when the engine failed. I had no idea if anyone knew where we were, or if they were even looking yet. The sun set around 6 in the evening, and the darkness that followed was unlike anything I had experienced before. In Minnesota, even on the darkest winter nights, there was always some ambient light, street lamps, distant highways, the glow of civilization on the horizon. Out here, there was nothing. The blackness was so complete that I could not see my hand in front of my face, and the only sounds were the wind howling across the tundra and the occasional groan of the aircraft's twisted frame settling in the snow. I rationed the coffee, taking small sips to keep my core temperature up, and ate half of 1 granola bar, even though I had no appetite. My leg had swollen to nearly twice its normal size, and the pain had evolved from sharp and immediate to a deep, pulsing throb that synced with my heartbeat. I knew that was bad. The body going into shock, blood pooling in damaged tissue, the beginning of a process that could kill me just as surely as the cold. I tried to elevate the leg, propping it on one of the equipment cases, and I wrapped it as tightly as I could with strips torn from the cabin seat covers. Sleep was impossible. Every time I started to drift off, the cold would jolt me awake, or the pain would spike, or I would hear something outside, real or imagined, that sent my heart racing. Dawn came slowly, a gradual lightening of the darkness that felt like a small miracle. I had survived the night, though I was not sure how much longer I could hold on. My leg had turned a mottled purple-black color that terrified me, and I had stopped being able to feel my toes sometime around 3 in the morning. The second granola bar went down in small bites, washed down with the last of the cold coffee, and I tried to make a plan. Movement was nearly impossible. Every attempt to put weight on my injured leg sent bolts of agony shooting up into my hip and made my vision go white at the edges. But staying still meant freezing, meant letting hypothermia creep deeper into my body with every passing hour. I decided to try and make some kind of signal, something that searchers might see from the air. Using the lighter and some of the aircraft's insulation material, I managed to start a small fire in a metal container I had salvaged from the wreckage. The smoke rose in a thin gray column against the pale sky, and I fed it with whatever I could find. Pieces of fabric, paper from the flight manual, strips of plastic that sent up black plumes. It was pitiful, really. A tiny thread of smoke in an endless white wilderness. But it was something to focus on, something to do besides lie there and wait for death. The second day passed in a haze of pain and cold and creeping despair. I talked to Dean's body, apologizing for things that made no sense, telling him about my failed marriage and my estranged sister, and the dog I had left with my ex-wife. I hallucinated at some point, saw my mother standing outside the shattered windshield, wearing the yellow dress she had been buried in, asking me why I had not called more often. The fire went out, and I could not get it started again. My fingers too clumsy, my coordination too far gone. I noticed that I had stopped shivering, and some distant part of my brain remembered that this was a very bad sign, that shivering was the body's way of generating heat, and when it stopped it meant you were in the final stages of hypothermia. I thought about giving up. The idea floated through my mind with a strange serenity. Just close my eyes, let the cold take me, stop fighting against something that was clearly inevitable. I probably would have done it too. I was ready. But then I heard it, faint but unmistakable, cutting through the wind and the fog in my brain, the distant thump of helicopter rotors. I do not remember much of what happened next, just fragments and sensations. I remember trying to wave, to make some kind of movement that would catch their attention, but my arms felt like they belonged to someone else. I remember the helicopter getting louder, circling overhead, and the overwhelming relief that flooded through me when I realized they had seen the wreckage. I remember voices, hands reaching for me, the painful brightness of a flashlight in my eyes. Someone was asking me questions, my name, where I was hurt, how long I had been out there, but my mouth would not form the words. They cut me out of the fuselage with tools that screamed and sparked, and then I was being lifted onto a stretcher, strapped down, carried through the snow toward the waiting helicopter. The warmth inside the aircraft hit me like a physical blow, and I started crying without meaning to, tears freezing on my cheeks before someone wiped them away. A paramedic was working on my leg, cutting away the makeshift bandages I had wrapped around it, and I saw his face go pale when he saw what was underneath. He said something to his partner that I could not hear over the rotor noise. But the look they exchanged told me everything. They put an IV in my arm and covered me with thermal blankets that felt like being wrapped in fire, and at some point I finally let myself slip into unconsciousness. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Anchorage, missing my left leg below the knee. The doctors told me I was lucky to be alive, that another few hours in that cold would have finished what the crash had started. The rescue team had found me thanks to a combination of factors. Dean's partial transmission had given them a general search area. A pilot flying a different route had spotted the smoke from my signal fire the previous day, and the Alaska State Troopers had coordinated a search effort that covered hundreds of square miles. They told me that Dean had died on impact, that he probably never felt any pain, and I choose to believe that even though I know they might have been saying it just to make me feel better. The company paid for my medical bills and my rehabilitation, and I got a settlement that was generous enough to let me start over somewhere warmer. I live in New Mexico now, working a desk job for a different telecommunications company, and I have not been on an airplane of any size since that day in March 2018. Sometimes I still dream about it. The endless white, the cold that felt like it was eating me from the inside out, the sound of Dean's last radio transmission cutting off mid-sentence. I wake up sweating despite the desert heat, reaching for a leg that is no longer there, and I have to remind myself that I made it out. That I survived. But a part of me is still out there in that frozen wilderness, sitting in the wreckage of a Cessna 185, watching the sun set and wondering if anyone is coming. That part of me never left, and I do not think it ever will. After my college graduation in 2015, my best friends and I made a pact to take one big adventure together before life pulled us in different directions. Mitch had just finished his EMT certification, and Carrie was about to start law school in September, so we had this narrow window in late August to do something wild. Alaska seemed perfect, raw, remote, untouched. Mitch had a cousin who worked on a fishing boat near Valdez, and he told us about this abandoned hunting lodge, about 40 miles from the nearest town, deep in the Chugach Mountains. The place had been closed since the early 90s, after the owner died, and nobody claimed the property. We figured we would hike out there, spend a couple of nights, take some photos, maybe see some wildlife. None of us could have imagined what was waiting in that rotting wooden structure, or that only 2 of us would make it back to civilization. We flew into Anchorage on a Thursday morning, rented a Jeep, and drove 6 hours to a small town called Copper Junction. Just a gas station, a general store, and maybe 15 houses scattered along a gravel road. The woman at the general store, a weathered lady in her 60s named Ruth, looked at us like we had announced plans to swim with sharks when we mentioned the old Whitaker Lodge. She told us people avoided that area, that hikers had reported seeing figures moving through the trees at night, strange lights, things that made no sense. Her exact words were that the forest out there had a way of playing tricks on your mind. Mitch laughed it off, called it small-town superstition designed to scare tourists. Carrie and I exchanged a look but said nothing. We bought extra batteries, some canned food, and a paper map since cell service would be non-existent. Ruth watched us leave through the store window, and I remember thinking she looked almost sad, like she was watching people walk toward something terrible and knew there was nothing she could do to stop it. The hike took us nearly 7 hours. The trail, if you could even call it that, disappeared completely after the first 2 miles, and we had to navigate using the map and a compass Mitch brought. The Chugach Mountains are beautiful in a way that feels almost hostile, like the land is reminding you every second that you do not belong there. Spruce trees so thick you could walk 10 feet off the path and lose sight of your friends. Silence so deep that the snap of a twig under your boot sounds like a gunshot. Around mile 6, Carrie spotted something strange carved into a tree trunk, a crude symbol that looked like a stick figure with its arms raised, and below it, letters scratched deep into the bark. Turn back. We stood there staring at it for a long moment. Mitch said it was probably some bored hiker trying to scare people, maybe the same locals who told ghost stories to tourists. But the carving looked old, the edges worn smooth by years of weather. And there was something desperate about those letters, like whoever made them had used a rock or a knife and pressed hard, wanting to make sure the message would last. We reached the lodge just before sunset. The building was larger than I expected, a 2-story structure with a wraparound porch, most of the windows either broken or boarded up, the roof sagging in the middle like a spine that had given up. Moss covered everything, and there was this smell, thick and sour, that I assumed was just decades of rot and animal droppings. Mitch was the first one through the front door, which hung crooked on its hinges and scraped against the floor when he pushed it open. Inside, the main room still had furniture, a couch with the stuffing torn out, a wooden table covered in dust, a stone fireplace filled with old ashes. But what stopped all 3 of us in our tracks was the kitchen area in the back corner. There were cans of food on the counter, and not old rusted ones from the 90s. These labels were modern, brands I recognized, and when Carrie picked one up, she whispered that the expiration date was still a year away, Someone had been here recently. Someone might still be here. We should have turned around right then, hiked back through the darkness if we had to. But we were tired. It was getting dark fast, and Mitch convinced us that it was probably just another group of hikers who had passed through. We decided to stay the night and leave at first light. That decision haunts me every single day. We set up our sleeping bags in the main room near the fireplace, figuring it was the safest spot since we could see both the front door and the stairs leading to the second floor. Mitch got a small fire going using some dry wood we found stacked behind the couch. Another detail that should have alarmed us more than it did, because who stacks firewood in an abandoned building? Carrie was quiet, kept glancing toward the dark hallway that led to what looked like storage rooms in the back. Around 9, she said she needed to use the bathroom and grabbed her flashlight. The outhouse was about 30 yards behind the lodge, a tilted wooden box that somehow still stood despite looking ready to collapse. She was gone for maybe 10 minutes when we heard her scream. Not a startled yelp, but a real scream, the kind that carries pure terror in it. Mitch and I grabbed our flashlights and ran outside, calling her name, our beams cutting through the darkness. We found her standing behind the outhouse, flashlight pointed at the ground, her whole body trembling. She could barely get the words out. She kept saying there were bones, human bones, and when I looked down I saw them too. A scattered pile of what was unmistakably a human rib cage, a femur, fragments of a skull half buried in the dirt. The bones were not fresh, but they were not ancient either. Some still had dried tissue clinging to them. Mitch tried to stay calm, said it could be anything, maybe a hunter who got lost and died of exposure years ago. But Carrie pointed her flashlight a few feet to the left, and there was another pile, and another beyond that. At least 4 distinct groupings of human remains, all within a 20-foot radius of that outhouse, like someone had been dumping bodies there for years. The smell I had noticed earlier, the one I blamed on rot and animals, it suddenly made a different kind of sense. We needed to leave immediately. All of us agreed on that. But it was pitch black now and the trail was impossible to navigate at night. One wrong step and you could fall into a ravine, or walk in circles until exhaustion took you. Mitch said we would barricade ourselves inside, take shifts staying awake, and leave the second the sun came up. We dragged the heavy wooden table against the front door and pushed the couch against the back entrance. Carrie found a rusty hunting knife in one of the drawers and held onto it like her life depended on it, because at that point, we all understood it might. None of us slept. We sat in a triangle facing outward, flashlights ready, listening to every creak and groan of that old building, waiting for morning. Around 3 in the morning, we heard footsteps on the porch. Not animal footsteps. These were heavy, deliberate, human. They moved slowly from one end to the other, paused near the boarded window, then continued around the side of the building. Mitch grabbed a thick piece of firewood and positioned himself near the front door. Carrie had the knife raised, her knuckles white around the handle. I held my flashlight like a weapon, which felt pathetic, but it was all I had. The footsteps stopped at the back entrance, and then came 3 slow knocks on the door. 1, 2, 3. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. Then a voice, low and gravelly, muffled through the wood. "I know you're in there. I saw your fire." My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Mitch whispered for us to stay quiet. Maybe whoever it was would leave if we did not respond. For a long moment there was silence. Then the voice again, closer now, like the person had pressed their face against the door. "This is my home. You're sleeping in my home." The handle jiggled. The couch we had pushed against the door shifted an inch. Carrie let out a small whimper, and I grabbed her arm, squeezing hard, begging her silently to stay quiet. The jiggling stopped. The footsteps retreated, slow and unhurried, like whoever was out there had all the time in the world. We heard them circle the building once more, then fade into the forest. For the next 2 hours, nothing. Just the wind and the occasional crack of branches in the distance. By 5, the sky started to lighten, and we made the decision to run. We grabbed our packs, left everything else, and Mitch pulled the table away from the front door. He opened it slowly, checking both directions and motioned for us to follow. We made it maybe 50 yards into the tree line when Carrie suddenly stopped and pointed back toward the lodge. There was a man standing on the porch, watching us. He was tall, gaunt, with a beard that hung past his chest and clothes so filthy they looked like they had fused to his skin. He did not move, did not chase us, just stood there with his arms at his sides, his head tilted slightly to one side like a curious dog. And then he smiled. Not a threatening smile, but something worse, something empty and patient, like he knew exactly where we were going and had no doubt he would find us again. We ran. We ran faster than I have ever run in my life, branches whipping our faces, rocks twisting under our feet, not daring to look back. We had been moving for maybe an hour when Mitch stopped and said he needed to check the map. We were lost. Nothing looked familiar, and in our panic we had veered completely off the route we had marked the day before. The forest was dense here, the trees so close together that sunlight barely penetrated, and everything looked the same in every direction. Carrie was crying quietly, trying to muffle the sound with her sleeve. I kept scanning the trees behind us, expecting to see that gaunt figure emerge at any moment. Mitch spread the map on a fallen log and tried to orient us using the compass, but his hands were unsteady and the needle kept jumping. That is when we heard it. A sharp whistle, high-pitched and deliberate, coming from somewhere to our left. Then another whistle answered from the right, and a third from behind us. There was more than one person out there. The man at the lodge was not alone. Mitch shoved the map in his pack and grabbed Carrie by the arm, pulling her forward. We picked a direction and moved as fast as we could, trying to stay quiet but knowing that whoever was out there already knew exactly where we were. The whistles continued, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, like they were hurting us somewhere specific. Around midday, we stumbled into a small clearing and found another carved message on a tree. This one was newer, the letters still pale against the dark bark. No one comes. Below it, scratched in smaller, shakier writing, "He keeps us here." Carrie started hyperventilating, and I had to hold her face in my hands and force her to look at me, to breathe with me, to stay focused. Mitch was pacing the edge of the clearing, looking for any sign of a trail, when the attack came. The man appeared from nowhere. Not the bearded one from the lodge, but someone younger, faster, wearing torn military fatigues and carrying a length of rusted chain. He swung it at Mitch before any of us could react, catching him across the back of the shoulders and sending him sprawling into the dirt. Carrie screamed and lunged with her knife, slashing wildly, and caught the attacker across the forearm. He howled and stumbled backward, giving Mitch enough time to scramble to his feet. I grabbed a rock the size of my fist and threw it as hard as I could, hitting the man in the chest. He looked at me with these pale, empty eyes, not angry, not pained, just hollow, and then retreated into the trees as quickly as he had appeared. Mitch was bleeding through his shirt, deep welts already forming where the chain had struck. We had to keep moving. For the next 3 hours, we pushed through the forest with no real sense of direction, just desperate to put distance between us and whoever was hunting us. Mitch was slowing down, the pain in his back making every step a struggle, and Carrie had gone silent in a way that scared me more than her crying had. The whistles had stopped, which somehow felt worse, like they had decided to let us exhaust ourselves before closing in. Around 4 in the afternoon, I heard something that made me want to collapse with relief. The sound of running water. We followed it and found a river, maybe 30 feet wide, moving fast with snowmelt from the mountains. I remembered from the map that a river ran near the main road about 15 miles from where we had started. If we followed it downstream, we might find civilization. We waded in, the cold shocking the breath out of us, and let the current carry us as much as we could manage while keeping our footing. Mitch slipped twice, and the second time, Carrie and I had to drag him up before the water pulled him under. We stayed in that river for what felt like hours, our legs going numb, our teeth chattering so hard I thought they might crack. But nobody followed us into the water. Whatever advantage they had in the forest, the river took it away. Just before sunset, we saw a bridge in the distance. A real bridge, concrete and metal, with a gravel road running across it. We climbed out of the river on shaking legs and stumbled up the embankment to the road. A pickup truck came by within 20 minutes, driven by a man named Earl who took one look at us and did not ask questions, just told us to get in. He drove us straight to a state trooper station in a town called Ridgewater, about 60 miles from Copper Junction. We told them everything: the lodge, the bones, the man on the porch, the whistles, the attack. They listened with expressions that shifted from skepticism to something darker as we spoke. One of the troopers, a woman with gray streaks in her hair, finally said they had been looking for a man named Vernon Crisp for almost 8 years. He had escaped from a corrections facility in 2007, serving time for multiple counts of kidnapping and assault. They had assumed he fled to Canada or died in the wilderness. Instead, he had built himself a compound out there, attracting other fugitives, other broken men who wanted to disappear. The trooper said they had received reports over the years, hikers talking about ghosts in the forest, strange figures, carved warnings, but nobody had ever come back with enough information to launch a real search. Until us. The raid happened 3 days later. State troopers, FBI, search and rescue teams. They went in with helicopters and dogs and enough manpower to sweep every inch of that mountain. They found Vernon Crisp in the lodge, sitting in a chair by the fireplace like he had been expecting them. He did not resist. The 2 other men they captured in the surrounding forest put up more of a fight, but both were taken alive. What they found behind that lodge was worse than anything we had seen. 17 sets of remains, some dating back to the late 90s, others much more recent. They also found a root cellar about 100 yards from the main building, dug into the hillside and hidden by brush. Inside were journals, dozens of them, written by people who had been kept there, some for weeks, some for months. The entries described everything: the captures, the isolation, the way Vernon would release them into the forest and hunt them for sport, the way some prisoners were forced to help him in exchange for their lives. Those carved warnings we had seen on the trees were made by the ones who managed to escape the cellar briefly, desperate attempts to warn anyone who might come after them. Most of those people never made it out of the forest. Their bones ended up behind the outhouse with all the others. Mitch spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering from an infection that developed in his wounds. Carrie finished law school but changed her focus to victims advocacy. She works with families of missing persons now, helps them navigate the system when the police stop looking. I still live in the same apartment I had before Alaska, still work the same job, still see the same people. But something fundamental broke inside me during those hours in the forest. I check the locks on my doors 4 or 5 times before I can sleep. I cannot hear a whistle without my chest tightening. And sometimes, late at night, I think about Ruth at that general store, how she tried to warn us and we laughed it off as superstition. The ghosts she talked about were real. They were just made of flesh and bone, like us. That is the thing nobody tells you about monsters. They do not need to be supernatural to destroy you. They just need to be patient and hidden, and willing to wait for the next group of people who think the wilderness is empty. It never is. I know that now. I will never forget it. Every summer since my dad passed, I make the trip up to the Kenai Peninsula to fish for sockeye salmon. It started as a way to feel close to him again, doing something we used to do together when I was a teenager. But over the years it became my thing, my way of resetting before another school year of teaching 4th graders in Seattle. My birthday falls in late July, and turning 37 alone on a riverbank with nothing but the sound of rushing water and birdsong felt like exactly what I needed. I had been doing this solo trip for 6 years without any real incident. A few close calls with moose, one scary moment when I slipped on wet rocks and almost went into the current, but nothing that made me question whether I should keep coming back. The spot I always use is about 4 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a trail that most people skip because there are easier fishing spots closer to civilization. That remoteness was always the appeal. I flew into Anchorage on a Tuesday morning and picked up my rental truck, a beat-up Ford that smelled like cigarettes and prior renters who did not believe in air freshener. The drive down to the peninsula took about 4 hours, and I stopped in Soldotna to grab last-minute supplies and check in with the ranger station like I always do. The guy working the desk, a younger ranger I had not seen before, warned me about increased bear activity in the area. He said the salmon run was strong this year, which meant the browns were coming down from higher elevations earlier than usual. I thanked him and told him I had bear spray and air horn and knew how to store my food properly. He gave me this look, not condescending exactly, but like he wanted to say something more and decided against it. I wish now that I had asked him what he was thinking. I wish I had paid more attention to the weight behind that look, instead of brushing it off as a ranger doing his job. The hike in took me about 2.5 hours with my pack, which was heavier than usual, because I had brought extra food for a 5-day stay. I reached my usual campsite around 4 in the afternoon, plenty of daylight left to set up, and maybe get a few casts in before dinner. The spot sits on a slight rise about 60 feet from the riverbank, sheltered by a thick stand of spruce trees on 3 sides. The river curves there, creating a natural pool where the salmon tend to gather before pushing upstream. I had caught my limit here every single year. I set up my tent, hung my food cache from the bare wire that someone had installed years ago between 2 tall spruces, and took a walk down to the water to check conditions. The river was running a bit higher than I remembered from previous years, probably from snowmelt, and the water had that murky glacial color that makes it hard to see more than a few inches below the surface. I noticed fish jumping out near the middle of the current, silver flashes catching the late afternoon sun, and I felt that familiar excitement in my chest. That first evening was perfect. I caught 3 nice sockeyes before the light started fading, kept 2 and released 1, and cooked dinner on my little camp stove while listening to the river. I did everything right with my food prep, cleaned the fish downstream from my camp, washed my hands and arms thoroughly, changed into clean clothes that I kept sealed in a dry bag. I was careful. I am always careful. Around 10, which is still pretty bright that far north in July, I noticed movement on the opposite bank. Maybe 200 yards away, a large brown shape moving through the brush. I could not see it clearly, but I knew what it was from the way it moved, that distinctive rolling gait. It did not seem interested in me, just working its way along the far shore, probably fishing in its own spots. I watched until it disappeared into the trees. Then I got into my tent and zipped everything up tight. I remember thinking how lucky I was to see one from a safe distance. I remember feeling grateful, not scared. I woke up around 3 in the morning to the sound of something moving through the brush near my tent. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the undergrowth maybe 30 or 40 feet away. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I lay completely still, barely breathing, my hand wrapped around the bear spray I always keep next to my sleeping bag. The footsteps circled. I could track them by sound, moving from the tree line behind my tent toward the river, then back again. At one point they stopped, and I heard this sound, a deep huffing breath followed by a low grunt. It was close enough that I could smell it, that musky, wet dog smell mixed with something rotten, probably fish. I do not know how long I lay there, maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour. Eventually the sounds moved off toward the river and I heard splashing in the distance. I did not sleep again that night. I just lay there with my eyes open, listening to every small noise, my body so tense that my muscles ached by morning. When the sun came up around 5, I got out of my tent to check the area. My legs were shaky and I felt that sick exhaustion you get when adrenaline has been pumping through you for hours. The ground near the tree line was torn up, deep gouges in the soft earth where something had been digging. And then I saw the tracks. They were massive, bigger than any bear print I had ever seen in my 6 years of coming here. I put my boot next to one of them for reference, and the print was easily twice the size of my foot, with claw marks extending several inches beyond the toe pads. I am not a wildlife expert, but I have seen enough brown bear tracks to know that this was an unusually large animal. The tracks led from the woods to a spot maybe 20 feet from my tent, circled around, and then headed down toward the river. I stood there looking at how close they came to where I had been sleeping, separated by nothing but a thin layer of nylon. And I seriously considered packing up and hiking out right then, but I talked myself out of it. That is what I keep coming back to, that moment of decision. I told myself the bear was just passing through, that it had not tried to get into my food cache, that it was probably more interested in the salmon than in me. I told myself I had driven 8 hours and hiked 4 miles, and I was not going to let one close encounter ruin my trip. I checked my food hang, which was untouched, and I made noise while I cooked breakfast, banging pots together and talking loudly to myself like all the guides recommend. I even did some fishing that morning, though I stayed closer to camp than usual, and kept my bear spray clipped to my waders at all times. I caught 1 salmon and released it because I did not want to deal with cleaning fish and creating more smells. The whole time I was on the water, I kept scanning the banks, the tree line, the bend in the river where I had seen the bear the night before. Nothing. The day was bright and warm, birds singing, river flowing, and I started to relax a little. I started to think maybe I had overreacted. Around 2 in the afternoon, I was sitting on a rock near the water, eating a granola bar and resting my feet when I saw it. The bear emerged from the brush on my side of the river, maybe 150 yards upstream. It was enormous, easily the biggest brown bear I had ever seen outside of photographs. Its fur was dark brown, almost chocolate-colored, with a distinctive silver patch on its shoulder. It walked to the water's edge and stood there, and then it turned its head and looked directly at me. I want to be clear about this because it matters. The bear saw me. It knew I was there. And instead of doing what bears usually do when they encounter humans, instead of running away or at least moving off, it started walking toward me along the riverbank. Not charging, not running, just walking. Steady and deliberate, like it had somewhere to be and I was on the path. I stood up slowly and grabbed my bear spray with one hand and my air horn with the other. I started backing away from the river toward my campsite, keeping the bear in my sight the whole time. I pressed the air horn, and the blast echoed across the water, loud enough to hurt my ears. The bear paused for a second, maybe 2, then kept coming. I yelled and waved my arms over my head, trying to make myself look bigger. Nothing. It just kept that same steady pace, closing the distance between us. 75 yards now, maybe less. I could see its face clearly. The small dark eyes, the dish-shaped profile, the way its ears were pointed forward with focus and intent. My brain was screaming at me to run, but I knew that was the worst thing I could do. You cannot outrun a brown bear. You cannot outswim one either. I kept backing up, stumbling over rocks and roots, and I hit the air horn again, 3 short blasts. The bear did not even flinch. It reached the spot where I had been sitting and it stopped there, sniffing the rock, sniffing the ground where I had dropped my granola bar wrapper. And then it lifted its head and looked at me again, and it made this sound, a low, rumbling grunt that I felt in my chest more than heard. I do not know what made me decide to go for the river. Maybe some survival instinct kicked in, or maybe I just panicked and made a stupid choice. My campsite was behind me, but the bear was between me and the trail that led back to the road. The river was to my left, and on the other side of the river was more wilderness, but at least it was distance. At least it was something. The bear started moving again, faster now, and I turned and ran for the water. The cold hit me like a wall when I plunged in, that glacial runoff so cold it locks up your muscles and steals your breath. I was only in up to my waist, but the current was strong, pulling at me, and I could barely feel my legs. I pushed forward, half swimming and half wading, trying to reach the far bank. I heard splashing behind me, and I did not look back. I just kept going, my arms numb and clumsy in the freezing water. The riverbed was all loose rocks and sudden drop-offs, and twice I went under, swallowing water that tasted like ice and silt. When I finally dragged myself onto the opposite bank, I was shaking so hard I could barely stand. I turned around, expecting to see the bear swimming after me or already on my side of the river. But it was just standing at the edge of the water on the far bank, right where I had gone in, watching me, It did not try to follow, it just stood there, and after a minute or two it turned and walked back toward my campsite, disappearing into the trees near where my tent was set up. I was soaking wet, freezing, starting to feel that dangerous sleepiness that comes with hypothermia. And all my gear, my food, my truck keys, my phone, everything was on the other side of the river, with a bear that had just chased me into glacial water. I had my bear spray still clutched in my hand, but that was it. No dry clothes, no fire starter, no way to call for help. I started walking downstream along the bank, trying to keep moving, trying to generate body heat. I knew there was a fishing lodge about 6 miles downriver. I had seen it on my map when planning the trip. 6 miles through dense brush and uneven terrain in wet clothes with the temperature dropping as evening approached. I did not think about whether I could make it. I just walked. It took me almost 5 hours to reach that lodge. By the time I stumbled out of the tree line and a guest spotted me, I could not feel my feet and my lips were blue. They wrapped me in blankets and called for a medical helicopter because my core temperature had dropped to 92 degrees, which is apparently when organs start having trouble. I spent 2 nights in a hospital in Anchorage being treated for moderate hypothermia and mild frostbite on 3 of my toes. The Rangers went back to my campsite the next day and found my tent shredded, my food cache pulled down from the wire and scattered everywhere. They found tracks all around the site, the same massive prints I had seen that morning. They told me later that there had been reports of a large male brown bear in that area, exhibiting unusually bold behavior around humans, possibly because someone had been feeding it earlier in the season. They never caught it as far as I know. I still go fishing every summer, but not there, never there again. And every time I see a bear in the distance now, even in a zoo, I feel my chest tighten and I remember that steady walk along the riverbank, those small, dark eyes fixed on me. And I remember how it feels to be looked at not as a threat or a curiosity, but as something else entirely. November in Alaska feels like the world is slowly dying, and that particular November felt worse than most. I had been covering crime stories for the Anchorage Daily Herald since my journalism school graduation back in 2009, staying in this frozen corner of the country because the isolation bred stories nobody else wanted to touch. My editor dropped a folder on my desk containing 6 missing persons cases spanning 15 years, all connected to an abandoned copper mine called Raven Shaft near a forgotten town named Ketchum Falls. The mine had been closed since 1987 after a collapse killed 4 workers, but hikers and amateur explorers kept wandering in over the decades. None of them came back out. Local authorities had stopped sending search parties after the 3rd disappearance because the cave system was too unstable, too deep, and too cold. The families never got answers. The cases went cold, and something about that silence made me volunteer to investigate. I spent 3 weeks researching before I ever set foot near that mountain. The mine entrance sat about 40 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by a rough trail that became impassable once the heavy snow arrived in December. I connected with a geological survey team from the University of Fairbanks, who had been trying to get funding to map the cave system for years. Their leader was a woman named Ingrid Solberg, maybe 50 years old with sun-damaged skin and a handshake that could crush walnuts. She had lost a graduate student to Raven Shaft in 2014 and had been petitioning the state to either seal the entrance permanently or fund a proper documentation expedition. When I told her about the article I wanted to write, she offered me something better than an interview. She invited me to join a 5-person team heading into the mine that Friday to recover whatever evidence they could find before winter sealed the mountain for good. I said yes without hesitating, which, looking back, was the first of many mistakes. Our team assembled at a ranger station about 20 miles from the site on a Friday morning, so cold that my breath crystallized on my eyelashes. Besides Ingrid and myself, there was her colleague Desmond Yates, a soft-spoken geologist in his early 60s, who had mapped caves across 3 continents, and 2 younger researchers named Cynthia Park and Jonah Fielding. Cynthia handled the audio and video documentation equipment, a serious woman with cropped black hair who barely spoke during the drive-up. Jonah was the safety coordinator, responsible for the ropes, the harnesses, and the emergency protocols that I prayed we would never need. He had this nervous habit of checking his gear over and over, running his fingers along the carabiners like rosary beads. The ranger who met us was a grizzled man named Cliff Bjornson, who had been stationed in this region for over 20 years. He made us sign liability waivers that essentially said the state of Alaska bore no responsibility if we died in that hole. He also told us that if we were not back by nightfall, nobody was coming to find us until spring. The hike to Raven Shaft took nearly 4 hours through terrain that wanted to kill us with every step. The trail, if you could call it that, wound through dense spruce forest before climbing a rocky slope scattered with loose shale and patches of black ice. Ingrid led the way with the confidence of someone who had made this journey before, though I noticed her pace slow as we approached the final ridge. The mine entrance appeared suddenly, a dark wound in the gray mountainside framed by rotting timber supports that had somehow survived decades of harsh winters. A faded warning sign hung crooked from a rusted chain, the words barely legible beneath layers of grime and lichen. The opening was maybe 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall, sloping downward at a steep angle into absolute darkness. Standing there, feeling the cold air rushing up from the depths like the mountain was exhaling, I understood why people called this place cursed. Not because of anything supernatural, but because it felt hungry in a way that only truly dangerous places can feel. We descended into Raven Shaft just after noon, roped together in a line with Jonah at the front and Desmond bringing up the rear. The temperature dropped dramatically within the first 100 feet, and the quality of darkness changed from the soft gray of an overcast day to something thicker, something that seemed to press against our headlamps like a living thing. The main shaft angled downward for about 300 meters before opening into a large chamber that the original miners had used as a staging area. Rusted equipment still littered the floor. Pickaxes and ore carts and coils of ancient rope turned brittle with age. Our boots crunched on a mixture of gravel and ice crystals that had formed over decades of water seeping through microscopic cracks in the rock. Ingrid pointed her light toward the far end of the chamber, where 3 tunnels branched off into different directions, each one disappearing into its own private darkness. She explained that the left tunnel led to the collapsed section where the 4 miners had died in 1987. The middle tunnel went deeper into the mountain, descending another 200 meters before dead-ending at a flooded shaft. The right tunnel was where most of the missing persons had last been seen, according to the sparse evidence that search teams had recovered over the years. We took the right tunnel, moving slowly and carefully along a path that grew narrower with every step. The walls were slick with moisture, and in several places we had to duck beneath rock formations that jutted down like broken teeth. Cynthia documented everything with her camera, capturing the strange beauty and the undeniable menace of a place that had swallowed so many people whole. About 40 minutes into the tunnel, Jonah stopped us with a raised fist. His headlamp had caught something reflective ahead, wedged between 2 rocks near the base of the wall. He crouched down and pulled out a hiking boot, faded orange with a distinctive zigzag pattern on the sole. Inside the boot, still laced tight, was a wool sock. Ingrid checked her files and confirmed that the boot matched the description of gear worn by a hiker named Russell Adkins, a 24-year-old college student who had entered Raven Shaft alone in 2016 and never returned. We found only the one boot, no sign of the other, and no sign of Russell. Cynthia photographed the discovery from multiple angles while I stood there wondering what kind of circumstances would cause someone to leave behind a single boot in a place like this. The tunnel opened into a second chamber about an hour later, smaller than the first but with a higher ceiling that disappeared beyond the reach of our lights. This room felt different immediately, and it took me a moment to understand why. There were signs of habitation everywhere. A sleeping bag lay unrolled against the far wall, its fabric torn and stained with something dark that could have been mud or could have been blood. Nearby sat a camping stove, 2 empty water bottles, a scattered pile of energy bar wrappers, and a backpack with its contents dumped across the stone floor. Ingrid approached the scene carefully, instructing everyone to stay back until she could assess the situation. She crouched beside the backpack and read the name embroidered on its strap, aloud. Gretchen Moody. According to Ingrid's research, Gretchen had been part of a group of 4 amateur spelunkers who entered Raven Shaft in October of 2017. The group had planned a 2-day exploration and packed supplies accordingly. When they failed to return after 5 days, authorities mounted a limited search that recovered nothing. Now we were looking at proof that at least one of them had survived long enough to set up camp deep inside this mountain. Desmond found the audio recorder tucked inside a crevice near the sleeping bag, protected from the elements by an overhang of rock. It was a small digital device, the kind hikers use to document their journeys, and miraculously, the battery still held a faint charge. Ingrid wanted to wait until we returned to the surface to examine the contents, but Cynthia argued that we needed to know what we were dealing with before going any deeper. The group voted, and curiosity won. We gathered in a loose circle, while Cynthia connected the recorder to a portable speaker she carried in her kit. The first file was dated October 17, 2017, recorded in the cheerful voice of a young woman who introduced herself as Gretchen. She described the group's excitement about exploring a cave system that few people had ever documented. The other voices in the background belonged to her companions, a man named Isaac, another woman named Shelley, and a 4th member whose name I could not quite make out through the static. They sounded happy. They sounded alive. And somehow knowing what came next made listening to those first innocent minutes almost unbearable. The second recording was made 2 days later, and the change in tone was immediate. Gretchen's voice trembled as she explained that a rockfall had blocked their exit route. Isaac had tried to find an alternate path but returned after several hours with bad news. Every passage they explored either dead-ended or looped back to the same chamber. Their food was running low. Their flashlight batteries were failing one by one. Shelley had injured her ankle during the initial collapse and could barely walk. The 4th member, whose name was finally clear in this recording as Bo, kept insisting that he had heard movement somewhere deeper in the tunnels. Not animals, he said. Footsteps. Human footsteps. The others dismissed him as paranoid, but Gretchen's voice carried a note of doubt that suggested she was not entirely convinced. The recording ended abruptly with the sound of something falling in the distance, followed by Shelley screaming, and then silence. We sat in that cold chamber, 5 people huddled around a speaker, listening to the echoes of a nightmare that had played out in this exact spot years before we arrived. The 3rd recording was the worst. Gretchen spoke in a whisper, her words rushed and broken by long pauses where she seemed to be listening for something. 6 days had passed since the collapse. Isaac was dead. She did not explain how or why, only that it had happened during an argument about their remaining water supply. Bo had disappeared into one of the side tunnels 2 days earlier and never came back. Shelley's ankle had become infected, and she spent most of her time unconscious, burning with fever. Gretchen described the darkness as a weight pressing down on her chest, the silence broken only by Shelley's labored breathing, and the constant drip of water somewhere in the distance. She mentioned the footsteps again. Bo had been right, she said. Someone else was in these tunnels. She had heard them too, always just beyond the reach of her dying flashlight, always moving away when she called out. She begged whoever found this recording to tell her mother that she had tried to survive. She begged them to bring her body home. The recording ended with a sound that none of us could identify, a low, scraping noise that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, followed by Gretchen whispering a single word that sounded like run. Nobody spoke for a long time after the recordings ended. Ingrid finally broke the silence by announcing that we had collected enough evidence and needed to begin our ascent before we lost too much daylight. I noticed that her hands moved with a new urgency as she packed the recorder into a protective case. Jonah started organizing our gear for the return journey, counting heads as he always did before any movement. He counted twice, then a 3rd time. His face went pale in the harsh white light of our headlamps, and he asked a question that turned my insides to ice. Where was Desmond? We all looked around the chamber, calling his name into the darkness, our voices bouncing off the wet stone walls and returning to us distorted and strange. Desmond had been standing at the edge of the group just minutes ago, examining some markings on the wall near the tunnel entrance. Now that spot was empty. His pack lay on the ground where he had set it down, but the man himself had vanished without a sound. Cynthia pointed her camera light toward the tunnel we had entered through, then toward two smaller passages on the opposite side of the chamber that we had not yet explored. Nothing. No movement. No answer to our increasingly frantic calls. Jonah wanted to search immediately, but Ingrid overruled him with a voice that shook despite her efforts to remain calm. She reminded us of the protocols we had all agreed to before entering the mine. If someone became separated, the group would mark the location, return to the surface, and contact authorities with proper rescue equipment. Going deeper into an unstable cave system to search for a missing person was exactly how more people ended up dead. I understood her logic, but standing there in that chamber surrounded by the belongings of people who had died alone in the dark, the thought of leaving Desmond behind felt monstrous. We compromised. Jonah and I would check the two unexplored passages for exactly 5 minutes each, while Ingrid and Cynthia stayed at the camp to maintain a light beacon. The first passage curved sharply after about 30 feet and ended in a wall of collapsed rubble that looked decades old. The second passage went deeper, angling downward at a steep grade, and about 100 feet in, my headlamp caught something that stopped me cold. A footprint in the mud. Fresh. Pointing away from the chamber, heading deeper into the mountain, the tread pattern matched the boots Desmond had been wearing. I called his name one more time, my voice swallowed by the tunnel ahead. Nothing came back except a faint echo and something else. Something that might have been the wind moving through cracks in the rock, or might have been breathing. Jonah grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward the chamber. Our 5 minutes were up. When we returned to Ingrid and Cynthia, I told them about the footprint, expecting Ingrid to change her mind about the search. Instead, her expression hardened into something I recognized from years of interviewing people who had made impossible choices. She said that Desmond knew the risks better than any of us. She said that if he had walked deeper into that tunnel on his own, there was a reason, and if he had been taken, then whatever took him was still down there with us. Either way, 3 more bodies would not bring him home. We gathered what evidence we could carry, including Gretchen's recorder and the photographs Cynthia had taken, and we began our ascent. The climb back to the surface felt twice as long as the descent. Every sound made us flinch. Every shadow seemed to move at the edges of our lights. I kept looking back, hoping to see Desmond's familiar silhouette catching up to us, but the darkness behind remained absolute and empty. We emerged from Ravenshaft just as the last gray light of day was fading from the sky. Cliff Bjornsson was waiting at the ranger station with coffee and questions. When we told him about Desmond, his face registered no surprise, only a weary kind of resignation that suggested he had heard this story before. He made calls to the state police and the search and rescue coordinator, but I could tell from his tone that nobody expected a recovery operation. The official report, which I obtained months later through a records request, concluded that Desmond Yates had likely become disoriented in the cave system and fallen into one of the many unmapped shafts that riddled the lower levels. His body was never recovered. The entrance to Ravenshaft was sealed with concrete and steel bars the following spring, and a new sign was erected warning that trespassers would face criminal prosecution. I published my article in February, though the editors cut most of the details about the recordings and focused instead on the broader issue of abandoned mine safety. The families of the missing contacted me for months afterward, desperate for any information I had not included in the story. I told them what I could. I did not tell them about the footsteps that Gretchen heard, or about the fresh boot print leading into darkness, or about the sound I heard just before Jonah pulled me back from that tunnel. A sound like someone whispering my name from very far away, in a voice that almost sounded like Desmond. My truck died somewhere between Talk and Delta Junction on a stretch of highway that looked exactly like the last 100 miles. White, flat, and empty. The temperature gauge had been showing -47 for the past hour, and I remember thinking that number seemed almost fake, like something from a documentary about Antarctica, rather than a road I was actually driving on. I had taken this relocation job from Seattle to Fairbanks because the salary was too good to pass up, and my 10-year high school reunion a few months back had been a reminder that everyone I grew up with was buying houses and having kids while I was still splitting rent with roommates. The plan seemed reasonable when I mapped it out. Drive the Alaska Highway in early December, get settled before the holidays, start fresh in January. I had packed blankets, extra food, flares, a full tank of gas, everything the internet told me to bring. But sitting there watching my dashboard light up with warnings before the engine gave one last shudder and went silent, I understood that all the preparation in the world means nothing when you are alone in a place that wants to kill you. I turned the key again and again, maybe 20 times, and each attempt produced a weaker sound until there was nothing but a faint click that reminded me of a dying heartbeat. The heating system stopped the moment the engine quit, and I could feel the cold pushing into the cabin almost immediately, like it had been pressed against the windows just waiting for its chance. I grabbed my phone knowing there would be no signal, and I was right. No bars, no data, nothing but a useless rectangle of glass and metal. Outside, the sun hung low even though my watch said it was barely 2 in the afternoon. That strange Arctic winter light that looks more like a permanent sunset than actual daytime. I figured I had maybe 3 hours before full darkness, and the thought of spending a night in this truck with no heat made my chest tight. I looked out at the road in both directions and saw absolutely nothing. No cars, no buildings, no smoke from distant chimneys, just an endless white plain broken only by the dark line of asphalt disappearing into the horizon. The silence was so complete that I could hear my own pulse in my ears, and for the first time since I started this drive, I felt genuinely afraid. I tried to remember what I had read about survival in extreme cold. Stay with your vehicle. That was the main advice everywhere online. Your car is shelter, it is visible to rescuers, it protects you from wind. But the articles I had read were written for situations where someone might actually come looking for you, where the temperature was maybe -20 and you could survive a night bundled up in blankets. This was different. At -47, the math changes completely. I had read somewhere that exposed skin gets frostbite in under 5 minutes at these temperatures, that your core body temperature starts dropping almost immediately once you stop producing heat. The blankets I had brought were good for a camping trip, not for a night in an unheated metal box when the air itself feels like it is trying to freeze your lungs. I did the calculation in my head. If no one drove by tonight, and the temperature dropped even further after dark like it always does, I would be dead by morning. That was not pessimism, that was just physics. I remembered passing a sign about 30 minutes back, something about a highway maintenance station 8 miles ahead. At the time I barely noticed it, just another green rectangle on an endless road. Now that sign felt like a lifeline, the only piece of information that might save me. 8 miles was not that far. I had run half marathons before, back when I lived in Seattle, and thought jogging along the waterfront made me some kind of athlete. But 8 miles in this cold, in snow boots and a jacket designed for Pacific Northwest rain rather than Arctic winter, with the sun going down, and no guarantee that the station would even be staffed. That was something else entirely. I sat in the truck for another 10 minutes, watching the windows start to frost over from the inside, feeling my fingers getting stiff even with gloves on. The decision made itself. Staying meant certain death by morning. Walking meant maybe dying, but also maybe living. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed it with the granola bars and water bottles I had brought, wrapped a scarf around my face until only my eyes were exposed, and stepped out of the truck into cold that hit me like a physical wall. The first breath I took outside felt like inhaling broken glass. The air was so cold that my nostrils stuck together for a second, and I had to breathe through my mouth just to get oxygen in. My eyes watered immediately, and I could feel the moisture trying to freeze on my eyelashes, turning them stiff and clumped. I started walking north along the highway, keeping the asphalt under my feet because I knew that wandering off into the snow would mean losing my sense of direction within minutes. The snow on the road had been packed down by whatever sparse traffic came through, but it was still slippery, and each step required concentration. I told myself to keep a steady pace, not too fast because sweating would be deadly. I had read that wet clothing in extreme cold is basically a death sentence, that the moisture pulls heat from your body faster than the air alone ever could. So I walked like I was on a casual stroll, except every part of my body was screaming that something was wrong, that I should be running, that I needed to get somewhere warm right now. After maybe 20 minutes, I started to notice that I could not feel my toes anymore. I was wearing 2 pairs of socks and my heaviest boots, the ones I had bought specifically for this trip, and none of it mattered. The cold had found a way in, like it always does, creeping through the rubber soles and the insulation and the wool until my feet felt like blocks of wood at the end of my legs. I kept walking because stopping was not an option, but I started doing this thing where I would curl my toes inside my boots, trying to force blood into them, trying to feel anything at all. My fingers were next, even inside the gloves, even tucked into my jacket pockets. The tips went numb first, then the knuckles. Then that numb feeling started creeping up toward my wrists. I checked my watch and realized I had been walking for almost 40 minutes, which meant I had covered maybe 2 miles at most. The maintenance station was still 6 miles away, and the sun had dropped noticeably lower, painting everything in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if they did not mean I was running out of time. Around the 1-hour mark, something changed in my head. I noticed it happening, which is the strange part. I was aware that my thoughts were getting slower, like my brain was a computer running too many programs at once. I would start thinking about something, like how far I had walked or whether I should eat one of the granola bars, and then I would just lose the thread of it completely. I found myself stopping in the middle of the road for no reason, just standing there staring at the horizon, and I had to physically force myself to start moving again. My body wanted to stop. Every cell in me was saying, just sit down for a minute, just rest, just take a break. I knew that was the hypothermia talking, that sitting down meant dying. But knowing something and feeling something are 2 completely different things when your core temperature is dropping and your brain is not getting enough warm blood. I started talking to myself out loud, just to have something to focus on, just to keep my mind from drifting into that soft gray fog that kept trying to swallow my thoughts. The road started to look different after a while, or maybe I was just seeing it differently. I could have sworn there was a building up ahead at one point, a dark shape against the snow, and I walked faster toward it for maybe 5 minutes before realizing it was just a shadow, some trick of the fading light on the landscape. That scared me more than anything had so far. If I was already seeing things that were not there, how much longer before I walked off the road entirely without realizing it? The highway was my only guide, the only thing keeping me pointed in the right direction. And if I lost it, I would be wandering in circles until I collapsed. I tried to focus harder, tried to keep my eyes on the asphalt directly in front of me, but my vision kept going blurry at the edges, and I had to blink constantly to clear it. The tears would freeze almost instantly, gluing my eyelids together for a half second each time, and wiping them away with my frozen gloves just made it worse. I realized I had stopped feeling cold, which should have been a relief, but I knew it was actually a very bad sign. When you stop shivering, when the cold stops hurting, that means your body has given up trying to warm itself. That means you are in serious trouble. I do not know exactly when I left the road. That is the part that haunts me when I try to piece together what happened. The gap in my memory, where the highway just disappears, and suddenly I was walking through open snow with no idea how I got there. One moment I was following the dark line of asphalt, telling myself to keep going, keep moving, and the next I was knee-deep in powder with nothing around me but white in every direction. I must have wandered off during one of those foggy moments when my brain checked out, maybe saw another phantom building in the distance and walked toward it without thinking. I tried to turn around, tried to find the road again, but everything looked exactly the same. Flat white ground meeting gray-blue sky and a perfect circle around me, like I was standing in the center of an empty dome. I picked a direction and started walking, telling myself it had to be the right way. But even as I moved, I knew I was guessing, knew I could be walking deeper into nothing instead of back toward the highway. The sun was almost gone now, just a thin red line on the horizon, and the temperature was dropping even further. I could feel it in my chest, each breath harder than the last, like the air itself was thickening into something my lungs could not process. My legs stopped working properly somewhere in that white emptiness. First, they just felt heavy, like I was wading through water, and then they started refusing to bend the way I wanted them to. I fell twice, maybe 3 times, and getting back up took longer each time. The last time I went down, I remember lying there in the snow and thinking how soft it was, how it almost felt warm compared to the air, how maybe I could just rest here for a minute before continuing. Part of my brain was screaming at me to get up, screaming that this was exactly how people die, but that voice seemed far away now, like someone yelling from another room. I managed to push myself to my knees, then to my feet, but standing felt like an achievement that took everything I had. I looked around and realized I could not see anything anymore. Not the road, not the sun, not any landmark at all. Just darkness creeping in from every direction and the snow beneath my feet, and this incredible tiredness that made every thought feel like pushing a boulder uphill. I took a few more steps, maybe 10 or 20, and then I stopped. Not because I decided to stop, but because my body simply would not go any further. My legs locked up, my knees buckled, and I went down into the snow one final time. I woke up in a hospital in Fairbanks 3 days later, and for the first few hours I had no idea where I was or how I got there. A nurse told me that a snowplow driver found my truck on the highway and called it in, and that search and rescue teams had been looking for me since the next morning. They found my trail of footprints leading away from the vehicle, followed them for about 4 miles along the road, and then tracked where I had wandered off into the open terrain. The footprints just stopped, she said, in the middle of a flat white field about 2 miles from the highway. No body, no sign of where I went after that. They searched for hours with dogs and helicopters, expanding the radius, checking every depression in the snow. A volunteer on a snowmobile finally spotted me nearly a mile from where my tracks ended, lying face down in a shallow ditch that had been invisible from the air. My core temperature when they got me to the medical center was 26 degrees Celsius. The doctors said anything below 28 is usually fatal, that most people do not come back from that. I lost 3 toes on my left foot and 2 on my right, plus the tips of 4 fingers. The surgeon told me I was lucky, and I wanted to laugh at him, but I did not have the energy. What I cannot stop thinking about even now is that gap between where my footprints stopped and where they found me. Almost a full mile of distance with no tracks, no trail, nothing to show how I got there. The rescue team leader visited me in the hospital and admitted he had never seen anything like it. The snow was undisturbed, fresh powder that would have shown every step, but there was just nothing, like I had been picked up and set down somewhere else. He asked if I remembered walking that distance, and I told him the truth, that I do not remember anything after falling that last time until I woke up in this bed. The doctors say it was probably some kind of automatic response, my body moving on its own while my conscious mind was completely shut down. A last survival instinct that kept me crawling toward that ditch where the wind was blocked and the snow provided insulation. Maybe that is what happened. Maybe my body saved itself while I was not home. But sometimes late at night, when I look at the stumps where my toes used to be and feel the phantom ache in my missing fingertips, I wonder about those invisible steps. I wonder what part of me was still walking when the rest of me had already given up. I drove through Alaska thinking I understood cold, thinking I was prepared, and I learned that there are things about your own body and your own mind that you will never understand, not even when they save your life. Seattle had given me everything I thought I wanted. A steady job at a busy clinic, a decent apartment, friends who understood the chaos of 12-hour shifts. But somewhere around my 10th year as a nurse practitioner, the routine started to feel like a slow suffocation. I needed something different, not just a change of scenery, but a complete reset. The kind you only get when you put 1,000 miles between yourself and everything familiar. When I saw the posting for a public health position in Koyukak, a village of about 200 people in interior Alaska, something clicked. My nursing school classmates were buying houses in the suburbs, scheduling playdates, posting photos of their kitchen renovations. Meanwhile, I was signing a 2-year contract to work in a place most people could not find on a map. The salary was decent, housing was provided, and the job description mentioned everything from wellness checks to emergency response. My mother cried when I told her. My father just shook his head and asked if I had lost my mind. I arrived in Koyukak on the last day of August, when the tundra was still gold and rust-colored, and the daylight stretched past 9 at night. A bush plane dropped me at a gravel airstrip about half a mile from the village center, and a man named Irving Tukala picked me up in a battered pickup truck that looked older than me. Irving worked for the tribal council and had been assigned to help me settle in. He was maybe 60, with deep lines carved into his face and hands that looked like they had been shaped by decades of hard labor. He did not say much during the drive, just pointed out landmarks, the community center, the general store, the fuel depot. When we passed a cluster of houses set apart from the others, he slowed down slightly. "Moreau family," he said, his voice flat. "They keep to themselves." I nodded, not thinking much of it at the time. Small towns always have their dynamics, their unspoken boundaries. I had no idea that those 3 words would become the first thread of something I wish I had never pulled. My first few weeks went smoothly enough. The health clinic was a small building with peeling paint and equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum. But it was functional. I saw patients for everything from ear infections to diabetes management, and most people were friendly in that reserved, cautious way that comes from living in tight-knit communities. I learned to read the silences as much as the words. A woman named Ruthie Anaktavuk became my unofficial guide to village life. She worked at the general store and had a way of explaining things without making me feel like an outsider. She told me which families had been there for generations, which had arrived more recently, and which ones I should just leave alone. When I asked about the Moreaus, her face changed. Not dramatically, but enough for me to notice. "They handle their own problems," she said, and then she changed the subject to the weather forecast. I let it go, but something about her reaction stayed with me like a splinter I could not reach. It was mid-September when the first real incident happened. A young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, came into the clinic with her mother. The girl had a gash on her forearm that clearly needed stitches, deep enough that I could see the white of tissue beneath the blood. But when I started preparing the suture kit, the mother grabbed her daughter and pulled her toward the door. "We changed our minds," she said, not meeting my eyes. "It will heal on its own." I tried to explain the risk of infection, the likelihood of scarring, but she was already gone. I stood there in the empty exam room holding a needle and thread, feeling like I had just witnessed something I did not understand. When I mentioned it to Ruthie later that day, she got very quiet. "That was Celeste Moreau," she finally said. "Her daughter Elise. They do not come to the clinic, they never have." I asked her why, and she just shook her head. "Some questions are better left alone out here." October came fast, and with it the cold. Not the crisp autumn chill I knew from the Pacific Northwest, but something deeper. A cold that seemed to seep into the walls, into your bones, into your thoughts. The daylight was shrinking rapidly, and by the end of the month we had maybe 6 hours of weak sunlight before the darkness swallowed everything again. I spent more time in the clinic going through old records, partly out of boredom, and partly because the incident with the Moreau girl kept nagging at me. The filing system was a mess, decades of paper records stuffed into cabinets with no real organization. But as I started sorting through them, patterns began to emerge. Death certificates mostly. In a village this small, you expect to see deaths from the usual causes: age, accidents, the occasional illness. What I did not expect was how many of those accidents involved the same handful of family names: Moreau, Ivanov, Tulik. Over and over again. Drownings, falls, exposure, hunting mishaps. All ruled accidental by whatever authority had signed off on them, but the frequency was staggering. In the past 15 years, I counted 11 deaths among those 3 families alone. 11, in a village of 200 people. I started making a list, writing down dates and names and causes of death on a yellow legal pad I kept hidden in my desk drawer. Maybe I was paranoid, maybe I was just a city girl looking for drama in a quiet place. But then I noticed something else. The deaths were not random. They clustered around the same time each year, mostly between late October and early December, when the village was at its most isolated. When the rivers froze, but the ice was not yet thick enough for safe travel. When the bush planes stopped flying because of weather. When getting out of Koyukak became nearly impossible. I sat in my small clinic office with that legal pad in front of me, the wind howling outside, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Someone was dying in this village almost every year, right around this time, and everyone was pretending it was normal. I made the mistake of asking questions. Not directly, not at first. I thought I was being subtle. I mentioned to Irving that I had been organizing the old records and noticed a lot of accidents over the years. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then said, "Alaska is a dangerous place. People die." That was it. Conversation over. I tried a different approach with Ruthie, asking about the Ivanov and Tulik families, whether they were related to the Moreaus. She stopped stocking shelves and turned to face me with something in her eyes I had not seen before. Fear, maybe, or warning. "You are a good person," she said slowly. "You came here to help, so let me help you. Stop looking at those old papers. Stop asking about those families. Just do your job, get through the winter, and when spring comes you can decide if you want to stay or go. But right now you need to stop." Her voice was barely above a whisper by the end. I wanted to argue, to push back, but the look on her face made the words die in my throat. She was genuinely afraid, and not for herself. That night I came home to find my cabin door unlocked. I always locked it. That was a habit from Seattle that I never broke. My first thought was that maybe I had forgotten, that the isolation was getting to me. But when I stepped inside and turned on the light, I knew someone had been there. Nothing was taken. Nothing was damaged. But my desk drawers were open, and the yellow legal pad where I had been keeping my notes was sitting in the middle of my bed. It had been in my clinic office. Someone had taken it, brought it here, and left it where I would be sure to find it. A message. I picked up the pad and flipped through it. All my notes were still there. Every name and date I had written down. But on the last page, someone had added a single sentence in handwriting that was not mine. "The winter is long and accidents happen." I stood there in my freezing cabin holding that legal pad, and for the first time since I arrived in Koyukak, I felt truly afraid. Not curious, not unsettled, afraid. Because whoever wrote that note knew exactly what I had been doing, and they wanted me to know that they knew. I should have stopped. Any rational person would have stopped. But fear does strange things to you. Sometimes it paralyzes, and sometimes it pushes you to do exactly what you should not do. The next morning, I went to the tribal council office and asked to see the village census records from the past 20 years. The woman behind the desk, someone I had never spoken to before, looked at me like I had asked for the nuclear launch codes. She said the records were not available to outside contractors, that I would need special permission from the council elders. I asked how I could get that permission. She smiled without warmth and said the council only met once a month, and the next meeting was not until December. I walked out of that office knowing I had just put another target on my back. That afternoon, I tried to call my mother using the satellite phone at the community center, the only reliable way to reach the outside world. The phone was broken. It had worked fine the week before. The man who ran the center, a quiet guy named Amos Chukwu, said a part needed to be ordered and it would take a few weeks. He did not look at me when he said it. November arrived like a door slamming shut. The last supply plane came in on the 3rd, and the pilot told me the weather window was closing fast. He asked if I wanted to leave, said he could make room for one more passenger. I thought about it. I thought about the note on my bed, the broken satellite phone, the way people had started looking at me differently, like I was a problem that needed to be managed. But leaving felt like surrendering to something I did not understand, and some stubborn part of me refused to give them that satisfaction. So I watched the plane take off and disappear into a gray sky, and I told myself I had made the right choice. By the middle of the month, the river was frozen solid, and the snow was waist-deep in places. The temperature dropped to 30 below zero, then 40. The village became a small cluster of lights in an endless darkness, cut off from everything. And somewhere out there in one of those houses, people were waiting for something. I did not know what, not yet, but I was about to find out. It was November 19th when Ruthie came to my cabin after dark. She had never visited me at home before, and when I opened the door and saw her standing there in the cold, her breath coming out in white clouds, I knew something had changed. She pushed past me without waiting to be invited, and stood in the middle of my small living room, rubbing her hands together. "There is going to be an accident soon," she said, her voice tight. "The Moreaus owe a debt. They have owed it for 3 generations. The Ivanovs and the Tulleks, they owe debts too. That is how it works here. That is how it has always worked." I asked her what she meant by debt, and she told me a story that made everything click into horrible place. Decades ago, before the village had any real connection to the outside world, the founding families made agreements with each other. Land rights, hunting territories, marriages, resources. When someone broke an agreement or wronged another family, there was a price. Not money, not property, blood. A life for a life passed down through generations until the debt was paid. It sounded insane, like something out of a history book about feudal societies. But Ruthie was not joking, and the fear in her eyes was absolutely real. She told me that the Moreau family had one more death owed to the Chukwu family, a wrong committed by someone's great-grandfather that had never been settled. This year, the debt was being called in. Elise, the little girl I had tried to help in September, was the one they had chosen. That was why her mother refused medical treatment. In their minds, there was no point in healing someone who was already marked. I felt sick. I asked Ruthie why she was telling me this, why now, and she said it was because I was the only person in the village who might actually do something. Everyone else had grown up with this system. They accepted it the way you accept gravity, not because it was right, but because it had always been there. Outsiders were usually discouraged from staying long enough to notice anything. But I had noticed, and I had kept asking questions, and now I was the only wild card in a game that had been playing out for generations. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my cabin with every light on, thinking through my options. Running was not possible. The snow was too deep, the cold too extreme, and the nearest town was over 60 miles away through wilderness. The satellite phone was still broken. I had no way to contact anyone outside, but I had something else: the clinic. Medical supplies, locked cabinets, and most importantly, a shortwave radio that I had seen in the back storage room during my first week. It was old and covered in dust, probably left over from the 80s, but it might still work. Before dawn, I walked to the clinic through knee-deep snow, my flashlight cutting a thin beam through the darkness. The radio was exactly where I remembered it. Took me almost an hour to figure out how to operate it, my fingers numb and clumsy. But finally I managed to reach a state trooper station in Fairbanks. I told them everything: the pattern of deaths, the threats, the little girl who was in danger. The officer on the other end sounded skeptical at first, but something in my voice must have convinced him, because he said he would send a team as soon as the weather cleared. He told me to stay inside, keep my head down, and wait. The next 3 days were the longest of my life. I stayed in the clinic, sleeping on the exam table, eating canned food from the emergency supplies. On the second day, someone tried the door handle in the middle of the night. It was locked, and whoever it was eventually went away, but I did not close my eyes again until morning. On the fourth day, I heard the sound of helicopter blades cutting through the frozen air. 2 state troopers and a child welfare officer landed on the outskirts of the village, and within hours, Elise Moreau was in protective custody. I do not know exactly what happened after that. I was evacuated on the same helicopter and never went back. I heard later that several people were arrested, that the investigation uncovered evidence of at least 7 deaths that were being reclassified as homicides. The village of Koyukak was all over the news for a few weeks, and then the world moved on to other horrors. I still have the yellow legal pad with the threat written on the last page. Sometimes I take it out and look at that handwriting, and I wonder who wrote it. I wonder if they are still out there in some other small place keeping old debts alive. And I wonder how many other villages exist where the winter is long and accidents happen and nobody asks why. Working at a temporary construction camp in Alaska felt like a strange pause in my life. Something I told myself was just a means to an end. I'd taken the job because the pay was good, and I needed to clear some debts, and the camp promised short rotations and long stretches of time off. At that point, my life was simple and quiet, mostly work, sleep, and the occasional call home when the satellite signal cooperated. The camp itself sat far from any real town, surrounded by uneven ground, frozen mud, and a horizon that never felt close. Rows of portable trailers were bolted into the dirt like they might slide away if no one watched them. Most of us were strangers to each other, passing through, carrying our own reasons for being there. That made it easy to keep your head down and mind your business. It also made it easy for things to happen without anyone asking too many questions. The day everything started to bother me wasn't dramatic at first, just oddly quiet. A guy named Trevor, who bunked 2 trailers down from me, didn't show up for breakfast. No note, no warning, just his locker cleared out and his boots gone. People said he'd quit overnight, which wasn't unheard of, but the way everyone accepted it felt rehearsed. This wasn't the first time either. Over the previous months, workers had vanished from the schedule between shifts. No goodbye drinks, no heated arguments with supervisors, nothing you'd expect from someone leaving suddenly. Management always brushed it off as personal issues or better offers elsewhere. The explanations were thin, but nobody pushed back. In a place like that, asking questions made you stand out. That night I worked the late shift, doing equipment checks near the edge of the camp where the lights barely reached. The generators hummed unevenly, and the cold crept through my gloves no matter how tightly I clenched my fingers. Somewhere past the trailers, I heard raised voices, low and sharp, like an argument being swallowed by the wind. I couldn't see who it was, only the outline of someone moving between structures, staying close to the shadows. When I walked closer, the voices stopped instantly, leaving behind an empty stretch of gravel and a feeling that I'd interrupted something I wasn't meant to see. Later, in the break room, a newer worker named Eli sat staring at the floor, jaw clenched, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. He clocked out early and didn't come back. By the next morning, Eli's trailer was locked and stripped bare, same as Trevor's. This time, though, I noticed scuff marks near the steps, deep grooves in the mud that looked like someone had been dragged or pushed hard. I brought it up quietly to a supervisor, who gave me a tight look and told me to focus on my job. That response stuck with me more than the marks themselves. Over lunch, a few of us traded glances but kept our mouths shut, the unspoken agreement hanging heavy in the air. Everyone sensed there was something ugly underneath these disappearances. The camp's isolation made it feel like its own world, one where rules bent easily and consequences stayed far away. By the end of that morning, I realized the problem wasn't just people leaving. It was what might have been happening to them before they did. After that, I started paying closer attention to the little things people usually ignored. Conversations would stop when certain footsteps passed by the trailers. A few workers flinched at raised voices, even when it was just joking around. One night during dinner, I noticed bruising along the neck of a guy named Marcus, half hidden by his jacket collar. When I asked if he was okay, he forced a laugh and said he'd slipped on ice. The explanation didn't match the marks, which were too narrow and uneven. He left camp 2 days later without collecting his last paycheck. Management posted his position as open before his bunk was even cleaned out. It felt like the camp itself swallowed people whole, erased them, and moved on. The tension peaked during a night shift when one of the welders, Aaron, failed to check in at the end of his rotation. His radio crackled with static when we tried to reach him, and the supervisor delayed organizing a search, insisting Aaron probably wandered off to cool down somewhere. That excuse made no sense in freezing conditions, especially with the terrain around us. When we finally went looking, we found his helmet near a storage container, dented and smeared with dark residue. No blood trail, no signs of a fall, just silence and the wind dragging loose plastic against metal. By morning, Aaron was officially listed as having quit mid-shift. Seeing that typed out on the board felt unreal, like watching someone rewrite reality. A few days later, investigators arrived after someone finally contacted authorities outside the camp. They spoke to us one by one in a makeshift office, asking careful questions about threats, fights, and people leaving suddenly. What surprised me was how similar everyone's stories were once they felt safe talking. Intimidation in dark hallways, warnings delivered in whispers, physical confrontations that were never reported. One name kept surfacing, always followed by nervous pauses. The camp's setup made it easy for one person to control space and information, especially with new workers rotating in constantly. Oversight was minimal, records sloppy, and complaints quietly buried. Listening to it all laid out made me realize this wasn't a series of bad coincidences. The investigation uncovered years of ignored reports and unofficial settlements, all designed to keep the project running without disruption. The person responsible had learned exactly how far they could go, without triggering intervention, exploiting isolation and fear like tools. Workers who resisted were pressured into leaving, while others stayed silent to protect their paychecks. Eventually, the suspect was removed from the site under guard, though details were never fully shared with us. The camp didn't shut down, it just adjusted, pretending the problem had been solved cleanly. Even after things returned to a surface-level normal, the atmosphere never recovered. Every sound after dark carried weight, and trust between co-workers felt permanently damaged. I stayed long enough to see the investigators leave and the company issue a short statement about improved safety protocols. Nothing about the people who vanished, nothing about Aaron, nothing about the fear that had settled into the camp like a second climate. A few trailers were moved, a new supervisor rotated in, and we were told to report anything unusual. The words sounded empty by then. At night, the camp still felt watched, even with extra lighting and new faces around. People avoided being alone after dark, pairing up for cigarette breaks or bathroom runs. Sleep came in short, shallow bursts, broken by every sound of metal shifting or boots crunching outside. The place had learned our routines, and we couldn't unlearn what it had shown us. The day I decided to leave came quietly, without drama. I packed my duffel in the early morning, hands moving on instinct while my mind replayed small moments I hadn't questioned before. The way certain doors were always locked, the lack of cameras near storage areas, the silence from management when complaints surfaced. None of it felt accidental anymore. I turned in my badge without explaining myself, and no one asked why. That part disturbed me the most. It was as if the camp expected departures, accepted them as part of its design. When the transport truck pulled away, I watched the trailers shrink into the distance, lined up neatly like they hadn't held anything terrible inside them. Months later, back in normal life, the memories still surface at odd times. A generator hum can pull me right back to those nights, or the smell of diesel mixed with cold air. I read about similar camps online and see the same patterns repeated in different places. Temporary jobs, isolated locations, workers who pass through without roots. It creates gaps where accountability should be, and those gaps invite the wrong kind of people. I don't know what ultimately happened to everyone who disappeared. Some may have escaped before things got worse, others might not have been so lucky. That uncertainty is harder to live with than a clear answer. I'm sharing this here because places like that don't advertise their dangers. They sell opportunity, fast money, and the idea that you can endure anything for a short time. What I learned is that isolation changes the rules, and silence can be trained into people without them noticing. If you ever find yourself somewhere remote where people vanish quietly and no one wants to talk about it, pay attention. Leaving without explanation might look strange from the outside, but sometimes it's the only option left. I walked away with my life and a story that still doesn't sit right. Others didn't even get that much. At that point in my life, I was drifting between seasonal jobs, chasing contracts the way some people chase weather. Alaska felt like the right kind of distance. I was in my late 20s, traveling alone, working temporary gigs wherever someone needed an extra pair of hands before winter shut everything down. I didn't have much tying me anywhere, just a packed car, a notebook with phone numbers, and a habit of trusting my own planning a little too much. That morning started like dozens of others on the road. Cheap coffee, stiff muscles, and a long stretch of highway waiting ahead. I remember thinking that if I could reach the next town before dark, everything would stay on schedule. The light was already thinner than I liked, stretched low and pale across the road. Still, nothing about the day felt dramatic or unusual. It felt routine, and that's what makes it hard to explain now. The roadside stop sat alone against miles of nothing. A squat building with buzzing fluorescent lights, and a parking lot chewed up by gravel. Inside, the air smelled like burnt coffee and old fryer oil, the kind that sticks to your clothes. The woman behind the counter had tired eyes and kept glancing at the clock on the wall, tapping her pen like she was counting down to freedom. I told her I was heading toward the next town and expected to be there before nightfall. She gave me a look that lingered a second too long, then said something vague about the road being quiet lately. There was a corkboard near the door with handwritten notes for rides, missing dogs, odd local ads. One of the papers had been torn halfway down, as if someone changed their mind mid-sentence. I paid, thanked her, and walked back outside with that image still stuck in my head. The drive after that felt different, though nothing obvious had changed. The highway narrowed and twisted, the trees pressing closer, swallowing sound. Radio stations dissolved into static, then vanished altogether, leaving only the low hum of the engine. I noticed a vehicle behind me for a while, dark-colored, hard to pin down, but it never got close enough for me to read anything useful. When it finally disappeared, the absence felt louder than its presence had. I kept checking the dashboard clock, doing mental math about distance and fading daylight. The sky was slipping toward that heavy blue-gray that comes fast in remote places. I told myself I was imagining tension where there was none. Being alone that long messes with your head, or at least that's what I believed then. The last clear memory I have of that stretch comes from pulling over near a wide shoulder, thinking I should double-check my map before continuing. The engine cut, and the silence rushed in immediately, thick and pressing. My keys weren't in the cup holder where I always dropped them, which struck me as odd enough to make my chest tighten. I searched the seats, the floor, the console, telling myself not to jump to conclusions. That's when I noticed how untouched everything else was. My bag still zipped, jacket folded the way I'd left it. No sign that anyone had been inside the car. The road was empty in both directions, stretching endlessly, offering no clues and no comfort. Standing there, surrounded by wilderness that didn't care whether I existed or not, I understood how easy it would be for someone to vanish without a sound. What I didn't realize at the time was how quickly small decisions start stacking up when you're isolated. I stood there longer than I should have, listening to the wind scrape through the brush and feeling watched without seeing anyone. After a while, I noticed impressions in the gravel that didn't match my tires, faint but fresh, angled as if another vehicle had stopped nearby and then rolled on. It bothered me enough to make me scan the tree line, counting breaths, telling myself to stay calm and practical. I locked the car out of habit even though I couldn't find the keys, and that contradiction made my head spin. The light kept thinning, draining color from everything, and the idea of waiting there suddenly felt reckless. I decided to walk a short distance down the highway, thinking maybe the keys had fallen when I stepped out. That choice still echoes in my mind. The road felt longer on foot, every sound magnified by the emptiness. Gravel shifted under my boots, loud enough to make me wince. After a few minutes, I heard an engine somewhere behind me, slow and steady, not rushing. I moved closer to the shoulder, rehearsing what I'd say if someone stopped, friendly but guarded, grateful but not desperate. The vehicle passed without slowing, close enough that I caught a glimpse of the driver's profile. Eyes forward, jaw tight, both hands high on the wheel. No wave, no acknowledgement. The wind carried the smell of exhaust for a moment, then swallowed it. That was when the reality of my situation settled in fully. Night was coming fast, and I was suddenly very alone. I turned back toward my car, faster now, heart pounding for reasons I couldn't neatly explain. The sky had deepened into a dull, bruised color, and the forest on either side looked denser than before, like it had crept closer while I wasn't looking. When I reached the spot where I'd left the car, my stomach clenched, not from panic, but from disbelief. The car was still there exactly as I'd left it, but the driver's door stood open a few inches. Inside, nothing was disturbed. No broken glass, no mess, no obvious signs of interference. Just the quiet and the open door, waiting. I shut it slowly, every sense tuned tight, trying to decide whether staying or leaving on foot made more sense. I spent that night inside the car, curled up low, conserving heat and listening to every shift in the air. At some point, footsteps passed nearby, careful and measured, stopping just far enough away that I couldn't pinpoint them. No voice, no flashlight beam, no sudden movement, just the unmistakable sound of someone standing there, deciding something. Eventually, the steps retreated, dissolving back into the dark. When morning finally came, gray and weak, the keys were sitting on the hood, neatly placed as if to be found. I didn't question it. I got in, started the engine, and drove until I reached a town with people and noise and walls. I reported what happened, and searches were done, but nothing else turned up. Even now, I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. I only know that the isolation didn't protect me. It exposed me. After I reached that town, everything moved fast in a way that felt unreal. People asked questions while handing me coffee, while filling out forms, while glancing at each other when I described the open door and the keys on the hood. They focused on timelines, directions, mile markers. I kept trying to explain the feeling of being evaluated out there, like someone had been testing how far they could push before I broke. Search teams went back along the highway before the light faded again, combing ditches and tree lines, marking spots with little flags. I watched from the edge of the road, wrapped in a borrowed jacket, feeling strangely detached from my own story. Everyone kept saying how lucky I was. I nodded because that's what you do when you don't have the words to disagree. As the day stretched on, the questions shifted. Had I noticed anyone at the roadside stop? Did anyone seem too interested in my plans? I mentioned the board with the torn paper, the look the woman gave me when I talked about reaching town before night. One of the officers exchanged a glance with another and wrote something down without comment. They asked if I'd heard rumors about people disappearing along that route. I hadn't, but the way they phrased it told me enough. The wilderness wasn't just empty, it was useful. Miles of road, few witnesses, long delays before anyone noticed something was wrong. Anyone patient enough could wait out there and never leave a trace. By evening, they told me there was nothing more to do until morning. I sat alone in a small room at a motel, staring at my phone, replaying every choice I'd made since sunrise. I realized how close I'd come to doing exactly what I said at the counter, pushing forward until dark, trusting the road to take care of me. If I hadn't stopped when I did, if I'd ignored that missing key moment, the story might have ended very differently. The thought didn't come with dramatic fear, just a dull, heavy certainty. Some mistakes don't announce themselves. They wait quietly for you to be tired enough to make them. I left Alaska not long after that. I finished the contract I was there for, but the rest of the trip felt hollow, like I was moving through someone else's life. I still think about that stretch of highway and how calm everything looked on the surface. People ask if I believe someone was responsible, or if it was just coincidence and bad luck brushing up against isolation. I don't argue either way. All I know is that the road gave someone an opportunity, and that opportunity almost included me. When I tell this now, it's not for answers. It's so someone else might hesitate at a lonely stop and decide not to trust the distance the way I did.